Get my record button hit. All right. So welcome to the final training of this virtual session for County Fair Food Judges. So we are so glad that you made it back with us tonight. And just a reminder about videos, make sure those are off and that your mics are turned off. We will answer questions at the end, again, like we did last week. And I think we are ready to go. So welcome again, and we're excited for tonight. Okay, so we'll meet the team again. So we have Beth Henshaw, Extension Specialist for 4-H Youth Development in the Southeast area. Karen Blakesley, and she'll talk a little bit more with you tonight about our topic. She's an Extension Associate from the Rapid Response Center in the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry. Diane Mack is Extension Specialist for 4-H Youth Development in the Northeast area. Myself, I'm Jennifer Terrell, Extension Agent for 4-H and Youth Development in the Southwind District. Also on the team is Linda Beach. She's an Extension Agent Emeritus. And finally, we have Crystal Furtwell, Extension Agent in Health and Wellness in Johnson County. So thank you for letting us present this to you. And we're so thankful for Karen to supply all of the information for you tonight as well. Hand it over to you, Karen.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. It is really great to be back with you again this evening. I hope you all have had a good week, and I'm really glad that you all came back. So we have a lot of stuff to cover tonight, so we're going to just jump right into this. And as Jennifer mentioned, we will cover questions at the end. We've got a lot of content to cover first, and then hopefully as we go, if you have those questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. Jennifer and Crystal will monitor those, and we'll get back to those towards the end. And you might get your question answered too along the way, but don't be shy about putting your question in there anyway. I do want to give a special thanks to everybody on the team. I couldn't have done this without them. This was a true team effort, and so I really do appreciate their willingness to give this a try and to offer this training to you all virtually. So, and I do want to give a little special shout out to Linda Beach again, because she really helped me with jars of food that you're going to see tonight, and just kind of bouncing ideas off of each other. Linda and I judged together at the state fair for the 4-H division for food preservation. So she's a great resource for me, and so I really, once again, appreciate all of her help in putting this together. All right, we're going to get started. So something that we often hear as extension folks from the general public is people will call with a question about food preservation, and they'll often say, well, my jar's sealed. Doesn't that mean it's safe? Well, the seal is important, and it is important for the stability of the food in the end. But there are a whole lot of things that need to go right along the way, and even before that seal happens on the jar. So I'm going to get into a lot of science. Well, not a lot. I'm going to hit the highlights, I should say, of the science. I don't have time to get into all of it this evening. So I do want to give you some science background, the whys we do the things that we do, and some reasons to help back that up, and hopefully that will help you understand why we can things the way we do. I want to point out this jar in this picture. It is a jar of salsa. This was a jar that came through the state fair, probably about 3-4 years ago, and it was extremely thick. This was a homemade recipe. They made up their own favorite mixture, which is fine to do for making a fresh salsa, But when you put it inside of a jar and put a lid on it, that's a whole different environment for that salsa to live in. And this particular mixture was extremely thick, and it was practically like tomato paste. And so the processing time that they put on the recipe for this was pretty short, and I could not see how this product would be safe, and so I disqualified it. So I am going to talk about some of those things, the whys, that we would disqualify something like this at the fair. Again, all of the handouts, a copy of this presentation is all on the website. This website address down below. So all of this is on there. The handout on the right is a condensed version of this. So you can refer to these, go back and look at these as we go, or if you happen to have it with you, you can follow along. All right. Again, the road to the fair for these kids, there's a lot of things going on, and they're often going in circles, lots of things to think about. And then this year, we've got this happening. And as we all know, the governor did her speech just about a half an hour ago. I don't know what she said, but we will sort this all out. As of today, we still do not know the status of what's going on with the county fairs and the state fairs. As far as we're concerned right now, today, we're going with the fact that the fairs are going to happen. And let's hope they do, because we all want that. But just know that we are brainstorming. I am on a committee to work with the 4-H folks. We will be meeting Monday to start sorting through what could we possibly do if by chance we cannot do in-person judging. So there's lots of questions. Trust me, I have questions myself. So, so be patient with us. And if you do have any questions or comments or suggestions on how we might do this, you're more than welcome to send any of us an email. We'd be glad to take your thoughts and ideas. So let's get into the science of food preservation, because there is a lot of science that goes into this. And yes, it really does matter. And I'm gonna break it down a little bit. This is a jar of asparagus that is getting the vacuum tested on it, how well the lid pulled a vacuum on it. And so the science behind this matters. As I mentioned earlier, you can make up a lot of recipes that you can eat fresh, but when you put them inside of a jar, that's a whole new environment for that food to live in, and that changes how safe that product may or may not be. So let's talk about some of these things. Now, all of this that I'm talking about is not just for the fair. This should be normal. If you do any kind of food preservation, this should be what you're doing at home for your own family or friends. So it is not just for the fair. All foods need to be canned safely for any type of use, whether it's for your family, your friends, neighbors, or the fair. So my goal is to help you be smart about this and to be safe about it. And to start with good tested recipes and updated methods, that's going to help ensure the success and safety of your products in the end. I want to show you this quick little video here. I'll get it going here. This happens to be some salsa, and I'll play this a couple times so that you can see this. If you can see the salsa, it's kind of growing out of the jar. It's really kind of frightening. I'll play it again here so you get another chance. It kind of looks like a volcano coming out of the jar. So this was some salsa that came into our lab here at K-State. We run a program called the Kansas Value-Added Foods Lab. And so we get samples of food from small food processors across the state who want to sell food products. And so they send them to us. We test them for them. We can help them with nutrition facts panels and all kinds of assistance that we can give them. Well, this particular salsa came overnight. They shipped it overnight. We got a call from our mail room, and they said, we've got a box here and it's leaking. And so there were, 5 or 6 jars of this salsa in this box, and a couple of them have already exploded. And this salsa was way underprocessed, and so there was many things going wrong with this. I don't want to see this happen to any of you. And when procedures and methods are made up along the way, this is possibly something that could go bad and go wrong. I don't know what was growing in here. It doesn't matter. It was growing, and that's not good salsa to eat. It's a little dramatic, but I think you might get the point on what I'm talking about. All right, let me get my playing with my mouse here again. Let me try that. There we go. Let's do that. So, conditions for growth. When we talk about food safety, we use this acronym called FAT-TOM, and that stands for food, acid, time, temperature, oxygen, and moisture. Any combination of these conditions that are not appropriate for the product can allow bacteria to grow. And that's why the science behind this, the testing of these products, the test using good recipes to start with, is so beneficial to keep your food safe. Now, 3 of those that we look at in particular, we look at them all, but these 3 here really factor into the time and temperature, based on the food, and then the acidity, the oxygen requirements, and the moisture content. So I want to just separate these 3 out and detail these a little bit. So let's first talk about the acidity of foods. When we measure the acidity of a food, we measure it with a pH meter. The scale runs from 1 to 14, with 7 being the neutral point. And as you can see on this chart, all these foods that we like to preserve through canning all fall between about 2 and 7. So through research, we have found over the years, and this goes way back over a number of years, through research, that a pH of 4.6 is the dividing line. And so any of these foods that have a pH between 2 and 4.6 are what we call high acid foods. The lower the pH value, the higher the acidity that they have. These particular foods are acidic enough on their own, or they've had added acid added to them, such as vinegar to make pickles, turn cucumbers into pickles. Those high acid foods will not support the growth of botulism. Botulism is the key microorganism that we're concerned about when it comes to home canning of foods. So these high acid foods, that high acidity will not allow botulism to grow. So those foods can be processed in a boiling water canner, so that the main thing that we're concerned about is taking care of mold and yeast in these products that could possibly happen. Now, any of these foods that are between 4.6 and 7, these are what we call low acid foods. These include your plain vegetables, such as green beans and carrots, and corn. It also includes all meat products. So all of these low acid foods, these could support the growth of bacteria, of botulism. So these foods have to be processed in a pressure canner to get the temperature up to at least 240 degrees. And that there is no option to can these foods any other way. They have to be processed in a pressure canner. So that pH mark is a really important thing to look at to start with. The next thing we look at is water activity. This measures the amount of moisture that's in a food. The more moisture that's available for bacteria to use, they will grow. And so you can see on this scale, the water activity is measured on a scale between 0 and 1.0. 0.85, which is circled at the top in red, is the dividing line. Anything above 0.85 is what we call a high moisture food. And then anything below that is a low moisture food. So all of these fruits and vegetables and foods, you know, meats and all that, they're all naturally high moisture foods to start with. But there are some things that we can do to change them so we take the moisture away. For example, you can see on this little chart that jams and jellies fall below the 0.85 line. And that's because there's sugar in there. And that sugar binds up moisture and makes it unavailable for bacteria to grow. The other thing that factors in this is the canning method, the type of method and the temperature it gets up to. So high moisture foods are something that we have to look at. The other thing is oxygen requirements. There are many, many types of microorganisms out there, and they're divided between aerobic, anaerobic, and facultative. Aerobic organisms need oxygen to grow. Anaerobic microorganisms do not. And facultative ones can grow either way. Now, in this particular process of canning, the anaerobic ones are the ones that we're concerned about. And botulism is one of those. And so, yes, we're pulling a vacuum on these jars. We're taking the air out of these jars so that we can pull a vacuum on the lid, but it's the temperature and the time that's important to make sure that we kill any potential botulism that might be there. So, so that's another thing that we look at. In the development of recipes, one critical piece of information that we look at is called the heat penetration. And the importance, I want to talk about the importance of this. I know there's a lot on this particular slide here. So the times that are used in each recipe is based on how the food heats inside the jar, whether it's by convection or conduction or both. And these heat penetration studies help us determine the safe processing times for every recipe. Every recipe has its own processing time. So these heat penetration studies are looking at the cold spot in the jars. And I got some pictures of examples here. The top left picture is a wired data logger to monitor the temperature. You can see the temperature probe that's right down in the middle of the jar. And that's the cold spot of the jar. The one on the right, similar type thing, that is a wireless type data logger. And it also, that disc, that silver disc on the end of that stem is what captures all the data during the processing when the testing is done. And then the bottom picture shows you two cold spots that we're looking at. One is called geocentric, the second one is called isocentric. Geocentric is kind of right in the middle of the jar, and that really helps determine the temperature of dense type foods that would be put into a jar, and then the isocentric location is down at the bottom. So geocentric looks at the conduction, isocentric looks at the convection. So all of this is important, really important, because that cold spot has to reach the correct temperature for the right amount of time in order to destroy target pathogens that we're trying to get rid of, such as botulism. Another way to look at conduction and convection is with this picture here. The one on the left is convection, so you can see the food, the liquid, it's more of a liquid food and it circulates more. And then geocentric or conduction heating is more going straight through the jar, either from top to bottom or from side to side. So hopefully that makes sense. I got a little nerdy there, but that's just what I do. So anyway, it's really, really important. The other things that can affect the heat penetration is if a recipe is not followed properly and extra ingredients are added. Often get questions about, for example, making like a soup mix, and people want to go ahead and add either rice or pasta to it. We have no recipes for something like that. So if you try that and add that pasta or rice to it and can it according to the recipe for just the soup mix, you're slowing down how fast that heat goes through the jar because of that extra ingredient, that extra rice, that extra pasta, whatever it is. So it's really not recommended to do that. Also using the recommended canners. These heat penetration studies also are based on the heat up time and the cool down time that the canners do during that process. So this just really cannot be rushed at all. I found the video link down at the bottom. This is a video that was put out about 5 years ago from the Ball Company. It was then owned by Jarden Home Brands. It's called The Science of Canning. And you can go take a look at it, and they talk about the heat penetration study. So hopefully that will help you understand that a little more. And as far as not rushing the canning process, when the processing time is done, say we're doing water bath canning, you take the canner lid off, you really need to wait another 5 minutes. That 5-minute wait allows, hopefully you can see the graph down at the bottom of this slide. Right here is where the processing time is done. This green line, that's the water bath temperature. You can tell where the burner was turned off and the temperature really dropped. But as you can see here, these 4 jars of this red pepper spread, the temperature of it kept going up for that 5-minute time. So that 5-minute time after that is really important because that temperature is going to keep going up. So whether you're water bath canning or pressure canning, after you take the canner lid off, it's important to wait that 5 minutes. It allows the steam to get away from the canner. And it also gives an extra chance for the lids to seal. I know that the Ball folks found that this really does make a difference in helping the lids to seal properly on the jars. So hopefully that helps you understand the importance of some of the science that goes behind this. If you need a refresher on water bath canning and pressure canning, we have a couple publications on that. They're also in Spanish. You guys can go look this up. This is all on the website and linked on that handout, the "And the Winner Is" handout. So that's all there, and you can take a look at that just as a refresher in case you need a reminder. All right, let's do question 1, Jennifer. Get it going here. There we go. So which of these can be safely processed or processed safely in a water bath canner? Keep going. We'll give you a little time yet. Wow, there's 132 of you on here. Excellent. So glad you all came. All right, I think we'll call it good. Let's close this one out and share the results. Can you all see the results? Can you see the results on your screen? Can you see it? So in case anybody can't see the results, we had 35% voted for the peaches, 2% for the relish, 1% for the soup, 12% for the barbecue sauce, and 50% for option E, which was A, B, and D. And that is actually the right answer, letter E. Let me take this off of here. So good job, everybody. So let's see here. Get rid of that. Go back. There we go. So yes, A, B, and D. So peaches, yes. Corn relish, that's going to have added acid to it. So that can be processed in a water bath canner. And barbecue sauces have a lot of acid in them, usually a lot of vinegar. So barbecue sauce would be safely processed in a water bath canner. Vegetable soup mix, that will have to be done in a pressure canner. So good, very good, everybody. All right, so let's go into what judges are, the judging information. And so let's start with what makes you a food preservation judge. Similar to being a foods judge, you love to educate. You want to help these kids learn some things. You got to know some basic food science, and that's what I'm trying to give you here tonight. And understanding the importance of preserving food safely. And show them as you're talking to them that you enjoy preserving food yourself. Knowing these processes is really beneficial. And that makes you even a better food preservation judge. Some things to take. These are some tools that I like to take. A couple towels, couple washcloths. You just never know what might be sticky. I take a flashlight. Now, some people think that's a little weird, but you'll see after a while why I do that. You will find if you go into these buildings where you're judging, that the lighting is not always very good, and some of these products can be dark, and it's really hard to see what's going on in the jars because we judge everything visually, and I'll get into that here in a little bit. So take a flashlight with you. One of the first times I did this, I forgot my flashlight, and I used my flashlight on my cell phone and it died. So don't do that, okay? So take your flashlight, and it wouldn't hurt to take a couple extra batteries too. A ruler, take a ruler along, just a small little ruler to measure headspace. Take a water bottle so you have something to drink. Disinfectant wipes can be very handy. I take along my resources. A lot of times, I like to look up recipes, and I will tell you at the state fair, we look up practically every recipe because we want to make sure we are seeing what we're told we're supposed to be seeing based on the recipe. It does take extra time, but in the end, I think it's worth it. So the other thing is the scorecards, and I'll talk about the scorecards as we go along. We have scorecards for every type of product, not every single product. So it's like tomatoes, fruits, vegetables, meats. We've got scorecards for those. So take those with you because it can be really, really beneficial. Again, if you're asked to be a judge, you will get a copy of the fair book or at least a copy of the rules for the food preservation class at that fair. Read those over before you get to the fair so that you know what to expect. You will meet with the superintendents or the extension agent beforehand, and they'll usually go over a few things. And so take that with you so that you understand what that fair would like you to do. Again, all these resources are on this website. I'll put this up here again a couple times. As you can see down at the bottom, there's where links to all the scorecards are. I would print every one of those off and take it with you. That way you have them for sure. It's really encouraged that the counties provide these for you, but I can't guarantee that they all will. So that's why I really recommend that you take them with you so that you at least have these scorecards to help guide you through judging these products. And again, like I told you last week, I put all of mine in a little notebook like this and take it with me. As you can see, I've got our food preservation publications in there too. Now the Judge's Guide does not have food preservation in it. It's just the foods itself, but we do have all the scorecards. That should really help you on that. All right. Labels should be on every jar. This is the label that we have available for the kids to print off at home. You can print them off on the sticky labels. As you can see, we ask for some specific information on here, and especially the altitude of where this jar of food was processed, the process time, and the canning method, whether it was water bath or pressure canned, and then even on the pressure canning, whether they used a dial gauge or a weighted gauge. There is a little bit of a difference. And then the date that it was processed. So these labels are available on the 4-H website, but I also have them linked again on that fair judging website that I just showed you a little bit ago. So so you can look for those there. So all these products need to be labeled. Other things that are required, a recipe is a must. If there's no recipe, it should be disqualified. That's part of the state fair rules. I double checked that just to make sure. And so recipes are really, really important. And the other things I want to see is where they got the recipe from. And I'll talk about recipe sources here in a little bit, just to get you tuned in on what we're looking for. If they had to adjust their processing for altitude, that needs to be on there. I want to know the date of their recipe source. For example, if you have the Ball Blue Book, you can look on the inside cover and you'll look at the copyright date. That's what I want to see on there. If they're using Ball or Mrs. Wage's mixes, or even Sure-Gel, for example, Sure-Gel pectin inserts, I'd like to see them indicate the date that was purchased, so that we know that they're using fresh product. Clear jars only. I'll get into the types of jars here in a bit. And then for meat jerky, we must see a heat treatment listed, and I'll talk about that later so that you'll know what I'm looking for on that. So these are some other required information. Judging standards, again, the scorecards, they're on that website. We also have this publication called Food Safety Recommendations for Food Preservation Exhibits. Take a look at that for more information. If you can't tell, I'm giving you a lot of homework. Well, and it's because it's important. And so that way you are an informed judge when you are looking at these products. Now, I mentioned earlier that we judge visually. We do not recommend opening any of the jars of food to taste them. That is for the safety of you as the judge, but also the safety of the food product itself at the fair and then on the return home, and that we're not wasting food too in that respect. There are a lot of things we can look at and judge visually, and I'll get into quite a bit of that. So safety is the #1 consideration when you're judging food preservation, and unsafe methods should not be rewarded. I'm pretty hardcore about that. Don't mess around because of the fact I don't want to see anybody get sick. So, and so again, these are some reasons why. And the other thing too is not all spoilage can be seen by your eyes, your nose, and if you taste it, you may not taste anything wrong, but in the end, if it does make you sick, I hate for it to come from something like this. So there's a lot of reasons why, and that's why we've gone all visual judging. Even in open class, and at the state fair. I've even gotten the state fair open class folks to move to all visual judging, and they understand why. And so we just don't want anybody to have any issues. On the website too, I have a couple handouts for problems and solutions. This is another thing that I take with me in my notebook. So it covers not only meat, but fruits and vegetables and pickles and jams and jellies. There's usually more than one solution to an issue. So keep these with you. I recommend that you do that because it really is hard to remember all this stuff. And that way you can refer to it and hopefully figure out a reason why something might not look right. Another really good resource I recommend that you look at, this is from the University of Georgia. They have a program called the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And they have a really in-depth publication here called Judging Home Preserved Foods. The other thing that's really great about this is it gives a lot of tips on how to judge visually. And so it just takes some time to look through this and get some tips out of that. I think it would be really beneficial. It's not something that, this is one I do not take with me. If I do, I have it separate because I printed it off separate. It's a pretty large publication. But if anything, at least the first couple chapters that really get into the details on judging visually, I think would be really beneficial. Another handout I have on my website for you is this. Linda and I, we put this together. When we started judging together, we decided we needed a list of what we would consider something to be disqualified or something that could just be lowered a ribbon placing. This list has been modified over a year. We look at this every year and take into account anything new that we might see. Almost every year there's something new that comes up that neither one of us have seen before. So this list is on the website that you can print out. You can see it's a pretty equal list. But the disqualification side on the left, an unsealed jar, that's pretty much a no-brainer. No recipe, no label, wrong processing method, underprocessing, things like that. Using an untested recipe source. Contains alcohol, that's another thing. Just like in foods, we do not allow alcohol in the 4-H division. So, and again, for the same reasons back with the foods, because we're working with kids here from 18 and under, and so we should not be seeing any alcohol. And then lowered ribbon placing, you can see the items on that side. Things like messy jars, rusty rings, that takes away some of the showmanship. Uneven sized food pieces. Fancy pack is one I'll talk about here in a little bit because there are some particular things about that. Foreign material is another one. So you kind of get the idea of what kind of things we're kind of looking at on that. Also, this is just some extra things showmanship wise. These are not critical for food safety or quality, but when it comes right down to if you have to pick between two jars for like champion or reserve champion, these might factor in at that point. Hard water residue is something that's on the outside of the jars. That's an easy fix. Just use some vinegar and that would clean that up. I've seen sticky label residue from reused jars, which is fine to do, but the jars just need to be cleaned up a little better. So we don't have residue from previous years. Anyway, so those are just some other things to kind of keep in mind. If you haven't seen the Kansas State Fair 4-H exhibitor handbook, I put the link on here so that you can take a look at what's on there. We also have the list of recipe sources on there that we recommend. And I put down here at the bottom, that you cannot take your own recipe and apply processing recommendations from tested sources. We've seen recipes come through that are a homemade recipe, and then they applied USDA processing time and method. You just can't do that because you've got a whole new recipe. And so each recipe needs to have its own testing done to know really what it needs to be, how it needs to be processed, and for how long. So hopefully that is clear. So let me talk about recipe sources. You know, all of our publications, our home base is the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning, which is the picture up on the top left. So all of our publications, we have 10 publications for food preservation on foods that commonly are canned or preserved here in Kansas. These have been around for years. We update them about every 5 years or so. So the picture on the far top right is what they look like. We call this all our food preservation publications, Preserve It Fresh, Preserve It Safe. So we've got a unified look and feel. So, so those, even other extension publications, I have no problem with using other universities' publications because they may have recipes that we don't have. For example, for whatever reason, the last couple of weeks, I've had three requests to make dandelion jelly. Everybody must be looking at their dandelions right now. I find it interesting, and they must have a healthy crop of them. So there is a dandelion jelly recipe from the University of Wyoming, and so that is one that could be made. The bottom row of pictures, the one on the left, so easy to preserve. This is the University of Georgia's publication. They, in the university world, they are leaders in home food preservation research. They've done a lot of work with that. Dr. Elizabeth Andrus is the leader of that program. Her website, the National Center for Home Food Preservation, is a companion to this. So a lot of the recipes that are in this book are on that website. It's a great, great book. If you don't have them, if you don't have this book, I do recommend it. And several extension offices may have copies of this that you can purchase, or you can order it directly from the University of Georgia. Now, the Ball Blue Book, it's been around over 100 years. It is a great resource. And I have to say, they have really made a concerted effort to work with us, with Extension and the universities, so that we're all on the same page. I had the privilege of going to North Carolina, where their laboratories is, back in February before everything got shut down. Thankfully, we got that in. We got to meet with them. Ball and Kerr is now owned by a company called Newell Brands, and they are very science focused. They are making a really strong effort that whatever recipes they put out now are really based on hardcore science. I will say that the Ball Blue Book that's in the blue, that all new book of canning, this one came out about 5 years ago or so. That one was really pushed a little more by marketing, and there's just a handful of recipes in there that are just a bit questionable. And the ones I'm talking about have oil in them. And we university folks have some concern about that, because oil can sometimes protect bacteria and then it can still be allowed to grow. So there's a lot of really fun recipes in there. I'd be cautious about making the ones with oil in them. So just be aware of that. I haven't seen too many of those recipes come through fairs that I've judged at. I did see that picture of that mixed, those tomatoes one time, but otherwise there's a lot of gourmet recipes in there. But the standard Ball Blue Book in the middle is one that's a really, really good resource. And then I talked about the pectin inserts, the Sure-Gel packages. They've got some pretty tried and true recipes in there. I have no problem with those. Now, recipes older than 1994 may not be a safe recipe. And that is because by that year, the USDA did a major overhaul of their recipes and their canning recommendations. And so a lot of these older recipes that may be floating around out there may not be safe to do. Now, if you've got a really old recipe, a family favorite, and if you can find the exact recipe in any of these resources, then I don't have a problem using it. Just update it with the resource and the year that you're using now. But it has to be the exact thing. So that's something to keep in mind. So I thought this was kind of fun to see. This is a graphic of all the Ball Blue Books that have been put out over the years. It might be a little hard to see. I actually have my mom's old Ball Blue Book. I don't know if you can see this, but I keep it just to look at it. It's got some methods in there that I do not recommend doing, but it's kind of fun to look at. My guess is that came out in like the late 50s, early 60s. So as far as the year goes, if you can see the one with the 4 pictures on it, the Ball Blue Book, that one was done in 1994. So anything older than that, we don't recommend you use them, but they're fun to look at least. So, so anyway, that's a little history behind the Ball Blue Book. Now, packaged mixes, I have no problem using these. Ball has a couple mixes. It's a salsa mix and a couple pickle mixes. One's a bread and butter and the other one's kosher dill. I don't just follow their directions. Same thing with Mrs. Wages. They have a ton of packaged mixes that are really make this whole canning process a whole lot easier to do because you don't have to buy a whole lot of ingredients. Follow their directions. That is the key. I've seen some salsa, Mrs. Wages salsa come through like the state fair, and Mrs. Wages salsas are water bath for 40 minutes. And I often see some of these come through and they've changed that time to like 20 minutes. I'm going to disqualify that because that's not the right processing time for that mix. So it's real simple to follow their directions, and it makes pretty good product too. I have to say that. I love their salsa, by the way. These are some other mixes that have been out, and I think they are still being sold. This was a joint effort between Ball and McCormick Seasonings. They put together these little packets. They're a small batch. So each packet will either make 2 quarts or 4 pints of whatever product is. They've got salsa mixes, and this is a pickle mix. And then the directions are on the back, and they already have the spices there for you. I've seen a couple of these come through fairs, so you might see those. I've seen them sold at like a Tractor Supply or the Do It Best type stores, and then of course online. There's also a couple of apps for your mobile devices or your computers. This is from Oregon State University. It's called the Canning Timer and Checklist, and it's intended for people that have some experience in canning. But as you go through the recipes, it will prompt you reminders and make you check off the checklist to make sure you're doing all the steps. And it has a built-in timer for that recipe that you're making too. Another one is from Colorado State. They call it Preserve Smart. One thing unique about this one is from the very beginning, it makes you enter your elevation of where you're at, and the app will remember that throughout whatever you're making or whatever recipe you select in that app. And this one actually runs off of your computer too. I'm not sure the other one does. But anyway, might be something kind of fun to use. Also on my website, I have a whole section on recipes that's within the food preservation section. So you can see I've got all our publications on the right. They're also in Spanish. In the middle, you can see the National Center for Home Food Preservation, the USDA guide, Newell Brands, Mrs. Wages, Sure-Gel, some information about oils, and then the 2 apps that I just talked about. So you can take a look at that. And then down at the bottom right, links to other universities to see what kinds of things they have to offer. One thing we don't have is canning fish, but I can tell you Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and Alaska, they know about canning fish. So, so we're thankful for that. All right, let me talk about some unsafe recipe sources. And to start off with, you might see something in the grocery store and say, ooh, I'd like to can something like that. Well, not everything that's canned commercially has a recipe that can be safely canned at home. You could make up your own recipe version if you could freeze it if you want to, or eat it fresh. So that's just something to keep in mind. Some other sources that are questionable are blogs. There's lots of bloggers out there. I appreciate bloggers. They are fun and they have some really fun ideas. But it's really hard to tell if they have tested recipes. Pinterest is another one. That picture I'm showing in the middle there with that green funnel on it, this is somebody that's canning bacon. We have no recipes, no recommendations at all for canning bacon. I'm not sure why you would do that. But anyway, so be careful about Pinterest. I know it's really popular. Lots of fun things on Pinterest, but be very careful about the sources of recipes that you're finding on there. Old recipe books like church cookbooks. I showed you my old Ball Blue book. It's another one. But these old church cookbooks, old family recipe books, nothing against family recipe books, but who knows how safe the canning recipes are. So be careful about that. Some recipe magazines, it's really hard to know if they're adequately tested. And I will say that some of you have probably heard me tell this story before, but I tried to find out from the Taste of Home people how they test their recipes, and they were not very forthcoming on telling us how they do that. I even contacted the University of Wisconsin, up where Taste of Home is based, and she the food safety specialist there said she's even tried to work with Taste of Home, and she does not trust how well they test their recipes. So be careful about those. I really don't recommend using those recipes. Just be careful with them. Be selective. So just to give you an example, so this is a marmalade recipe. It looks really pretty. It's a pear based marmalade with orange and lemon and pineapple in it. Maraschino cherries kind of give it that blush color. But if you look down at the bottom, you'll see that it says to invert jars for 5 minutes, then turn upright. This is not a method that we recommend. This is called what we call open kettle canning. And it's because there is no heat treatment after the jar is filled, after the lid and ring are put on. And they also have an asterisk down below that. It says, or follow water bath method recommended by USDA. Well, that's real nice, but how much is that supposed to be? So, I mean, you can probably guess, but why don't they just put that in there to start with and test it to make sure that it's a good recipe? Now, so I hope that clarifies that what I'm talking about there. Another one, newspapers are notorious for putting in lots of recipes, and this one showed up last year or the year before. I actually saw it in the Hutchinson News, but it was, since so many newspapers are syndicated now, it went into a lot of newspapers all over the place. And this was called Labor of Love. They were talking about making salsa. And I know this might be a little hard to see, but down at the bottom, the processing, I blew up at the top right, I expanded it. It says to turn off the heat immediately transfer the hot salsa to warm sterile jars and screw on the sterile lids. They will seal as they cool on the counter. I'm sorry, that's not going to work. And I had a fit, and I tried to contact these newspapers. Didn't get a whole lot of help at all. And only one of them printed a clarification, which is down in the bottom right-hand corner, where they did say to a boiling water bath this for 20 minutes. I hope that was enough. But the other thing in this picture that it shows is a quart jar of salsa, and the headspace is huge. And there are no recipes for salsa in quart jars, only in pints. And that's because no recipes have been developed to be put into quarts. So if you see quart jars of salsa show up, I'm going to disqualify it, because there's no recommendations to process that. So anyway, that's just another example of an untested recipe. This salsa is probably pretty good fresh, but I would not want to eat it after sitting in a jar on the counter like that. Some other things that I've seen out in stores, I found these in Walmart last year. This is for refrigerator pickles only, so you should not see these show up at a fair. This is from Mrs. Wages, it's called a one-step pickling brine, and it only makes 1 pint. They're flavored. They have a kosher dill, a bread and butter, a cherry habanero, spicy one, and I can't read what pickled vegetables is the one second from the right. So these are it's basically a marinade, and you just store them in the refrigerator. Heinz also has this pickling vinegar base out, and I could not find it on their website, so I don't know if they still have it out this year. This is a mixture of vinegar and water, but it also has sugar and salt in it. On the label, it says it could be used for canning, but I would just use it for refrigerator pickles, because none of our recipes that we have been tested using this type of product. So I just hate for something to go wrong if this is used in place of what's recommended in the recipes. All right, Jennifer, let's go to question 2. All right, which of these recipes is not from a reliable source? Go. I made this one too easy, I think. That's okay. That's okay. This is great. This is great. All right. All right, let's go ahead and close that one. Yeah, pumpkin butter. Yeah, very good, everybody. So nobody voted for the bread and butter pickles, which is good. And we had a 3% vote for the reduced sugar peach pineapple spread. And that's from the Preserve Smart app. That's that Colorado State app that I talked about. So that one is fine. And then the elderberry jelly from Sure Gel, that one is fine too. But the pumpkin butter from The source is called The Frugal Navy Wife. Yeah, there are no tested recipes for canning pumpkin butter. So that's one thing right there that should not see at all. All right, very good, everybody. Let me go back here. Yeah, all right. All right, let me talk about some equipment a little bit. Types of jars. So the types of jars, use regular or wide mouth canning jars, whatever in the sizes, you know, regular and wide mouths, those usually come in pints and quarts. So the products that we enter at the fair are from a half pint up to a 1 quart size only. So the size of jar should be appropriate for whatever the food is that's being entered. You should not use a jar larger than stated in the recipe. I talked about the salsa earlier. Salsa is only in pints. So if a recipe, say a relish recipe, only lists half pints, you cannot put it in a bigger jar. And that's because it's a bigger volume, and that particular size of jar has not been tested for that recipe. So that's something to pay attention to. They should be clean, not damaged, no colored jars. We've seen these blue, green, purple, amber, and then last year they came out with kind of the aqua colors. They're really pretty jars. But we don't want to see these at the fair because we are judging visually, and we want to be able to see through the clear jars. No mayonnaise jars. Some people have a stash of mayonnaise jars, even though mayonnaise isn't even put in glass jars anymore. So we shouldn't see any of those. So it's typically the Balker and Golden Harvest brands. These are all owned by Newell brands, or they're all basically the same type of jar. Those are the ones that we should be seeing. There are some off brands of jars. I hate to pick on Walmart, but they do sell some other brand, their own brand of canning jars. They may not work quite right, especially the lids and the seals. I've heard some people have trouble with those. I've even seen the lids actually wrinkle on top. They're just not very well made. All of the Balker and the Golden Harvest jars are made here in the United States, and so they're well made. And so I think you can be assured that they're going to be a good product. Some newer jars that they've come out with here in the last 2-3 years, they have some jars they call a spiral jar. It comes in a regular mouth pint size, a wide mouth 28 ounce, which is almost a quart. So you use that like a quart jar. The jar on the right with the cherries, that's what they call their sharing mason jar. It's only a pint. And then down at the bottom is their smooth sided jars. So they took off a lot of the extra stuff that you usually see, and it just says ball down at the bottom. So you might see these jars entered in the fair, and they're perfectly fine to use because they are intended to be used for canning. One that's coming out this year that maybe you've seen in stores, they've come out with a new style of a pint jar. It's called a flute jar, and this is a picture of it. It's like a regular mouth size on top, and then it widens out to almost like a wide mouth size on the bottom. It's really cute, and it can be used. It's a pint jar, so, and it is perfectly safe to be used for canning. So that's the one you might see, or you can get them for yourself. Types of lids, the 2-piece lids system, the ring and the metal lid is what we recommend. The lid should always be new. Today's lids that you're buying do not need to be pre-treated, just for your information. They've taken that recommendation out because they reformulated the lid itself. the materials that are used in it. So they do not need to be pre-treated, meaning you don't have to heat them up. I do recommend you wash them, but you do not have to heat them up. If you want to, do not boil them, because too much heat, the boiling water could soften the compound too much, and then they may not work right. So that's just something to be aware of. The two pictures on the right, the one at the top, you can see a wrinkle in that lid. This is a buckled lid, and that is because a ring is screwed on too tight, and then the air, during the processing, the air is trying to fight its way out of that jar, and it's going to find the point of least resistance, and it will get out, and it will probably buckle the lid. And so that's just because the ring has been turned onto the jar too tight. You only need to screw it down till it stops, and then maybe another quarter turn. That's about it. That's all you need to do. The other thing to look for is the rings itself. The bottom right picture is a rusty ring. And over time, they do get rusty. Don't wash them in the dishwasher. That's another thing that's going to make them rust fast. But if they start getting rusty, it can start to make them hard to get on and off the jars. So it's probably time to recycle them or repurpose them for something else. The other thing down at the bottom, just a little side note, another thing that showed up on Pinterest, these people have been using these lids and rings to make little mini pies with them. While it might be cute, that's not what these are intended to be used for. I personally don't want to have melted rubber in my pie. So these are not intended to be used in the oven. Okay. All right, so the lids that are out now, they're all silver. They all look like this. They have an area on the top of the lid so you can write the date that you canned this product. They added extra tin plate to help reduce rusting problems. They're all BPA free. Anything that has plastic in any of their products is all BPA free. And they say the seal holds 18 months. Well, these lids should hold that long anyway, but just know that we always recommend that any home canned product should be used within 1 year, just for best safety, for best quality. Okay, so that's the thing about the lids for today that are out these days. There are these lids that I've seen. They're reusable. They are a plastic lid. These came out when the concern of BPA in plastic was becoming really evident. And so this company came out with these. They are reusable. You still have to have the metal ring to hold the lid onto the jar. It does have a separate rubber, the red rubber ring that comes with it. If you decide to use these, follow their directions. Now, I've heard people have had some good luck with them. I've heard some have problems with them holding a seal. The University of Georgia did do, she had a master's student that worked on some, her project involved these lids, compared them to the traditional metal lid and ring. And found that some of these lose their seal during storage time, lose their vacuum seal. I've even seen a number as high as a 40% seal failure. So, you know, it's personal choice. I've never seen any of these show up at the fair, but we do recommend that the metal ones, the traditional ball and cur lids, be used. All right. The type of pack that is used to get the food into the jar, there's two methods. Everything is hot packed, which is the picture on the left, and that is where the food is heated up with the liquid, and then everything's put into the jar at the same time. This is really the best way to go for everything. Now, there are a few foods, such as green beans and carrots, that have the option to pack using the raw pack method. And that's where you prep the food, you put it in the jar, and then you add the hot liquid. The hot pack is really the better way to go. You have less chance of floating You can get more food into the jar. The color is actually a little better in the long run because that preheating of that food is like a blanch step, and it helps set the color. And so you'll end up with just a little bit better color in the end. The raw pack method, on a lot of these, you really have to pack the food in pretty tight because it will shrink more during the processing. And oftentimes you'll see food float. So it's a little bit trickier. Honestly, it really doesn't save you that much more time. Really, the hot pack really is the best way to go on everything that you can. Headspace is really important. This helps determine how well a vacuum is pulled into that jar. It's different for different types of products. And this is the measurement between the top of the food and liquid and the rim of the jar, essentially. And it varies by the type of food. So in general, all of your jelly products, like your jams, jellies, marmalades, things like that, those are 1/4 inch. For fruits, tomatoes, and pickles, it's a 1/2 inch. And then for your low acid foods, it's at least 1 inch. There are a few things that are 1 1/4 inch. One exception in the fruits is pie filling. That one is 1 inch also. So on the scorecards, on those score sheets, I have listed on there what the recommended headspace is for each type of product. So that should help guide you on what measurement to look for. And this is where I use my ruler. Now, I've had people ask about using the headspace tool, which you see in the picture, and I've also got one here. You have to take into account the lid if you do use this, if you take this to measure the headspace when you're judging. So you have to take account that little bit of lid is raising up your measurement. So just be aware of that. But headspace is important. If there's too much headspace, that can leave excess air in the jar. The jar may not seal properly or not have a good vacuum seal to it. And on the flip side, if there's too much or too little headspace, then you might get food in between the rubber seal and the rim of the jar, and then the lid may not seal right. So headspace is important, and you should measure that on every jar that you look at. Adjusting for altitude. This is the #1 reason things get disqualified at fairs. And it is important. Kansas is not as flat as everybody thinks it is. And so we have to adjust. And good recipe sources will guide you on how to adjust it. For a boiling water bath, we increase the amount of time. For pressure canning, we increase the amount of pressure. And essentially, it's roughly, if you're over 1,000 feet, you're probably going to have to adjust. Now, where do you find out what your altitude is? There's all kinds of ways. You can look it up on the internet. I downloaded an app on my phone. It's called an altimeter, and it will tell me wherever I am what my elevation is. It's really good when I go across the state doing classes. Then I can know what my altitude is, exactly where I'm standing that day. So it is important, and this needs to be noted on going back to the label. They need to list what their altitude is, and then in the recipe they need to tell you if they adjusted appropriately for their altitude, whether they increased time or increased pressure. So that is important. So just to give you a couple examples, in the Ball Blue Book, in their recipes, they will remind you to adjust for altitude. In their introduction chapter, they have this chart which tells you the increments on how to adjust based on your altitude for water bath canning and pressure canning. The charts on the right, these are examples from the USDA guide. And so in each recipe, they have these charts, and it's based on what type of process or what processing method is being used. So that's in our publications, we have one big chart of all the recipes that are in that publication, and then the recommendations are given there. So that gives you an idea of where that is. All right, briefly, canning equipment, obviously pressure canners, water bath canners. Those are the two methods. That's it. There's no other methods that you should be seeing. For example, these here are some unsafe processing methods, and we have these listed in the state fair rules. We should not see any of these. Canning full jars of food in the dishwasher. I don't make this stuff up. People have tried this because they think it is a big appliance. It'll hold a lot of jars of food and then get a whole lot of processing done all at once. Well, dishwashers don't even reach 212 degrees. So no, not dishwashers, nor your oven or your microwave. The oven is a dry heat. And first of all, the canning jars, the ball folks, they do not put our jars in the oven because they will likely crack. And you don't want to have that mess in your oven. So that is an old method that should not be used. Same thing with open kettle canning. I go back to that recipe that I showed you where they turned the jars upside down and then back right side up. This is where it's essentially filled, lid and ring put on, turn it upside down, right side up, and you don't do anything else. Your chances of something getting yeast or mold in there is pretty good, and you don't want that to happen, or something else, who knows. We shouldn't be using any slow cookers for processing jars. That's not even, the temperature on those is not even close. Sun canning is exactly the same as open kettle canning, except you're setting all these jars outside in the sun for days. This should not be done at all. Very inconsistent heat process. The small pressure cookers, like the one on the right, those are saucepan type size. Those are meant for cooking only. That size of pressure cooker is not meant to be used as a canner. And our recipes are not designed for that type of pressure cooker. And then down at the bottom, these electric pressure cookers. I know there's some brands that have a canning feature on them. Please do not use them, and we should not see anybody entering in the fair with these. They're, from the data that I've seen, which is very little on these, the pressure in these, on a lot of them, hardly gets up to 10 pounds of pressure, which is really low. And these work a lot faster than a traditional pressure canner that we use on the stovetop. So that, as I mentioned earlier, that heat up and cool down time is important, and these could tend to rush that. So just cook in those appliances. Please don't use them for canning. I mentioned fancy packs earlier. Now, there are a few exceptions, which I'll talk about here in a second, but fancy packs are something like what I'm showing here in this picture. This was a jar of pickled carrots where they used the directions, the recipe, the ingredients, I should say, from the USDA guide. And then they used the directions from some magazine, I think it was, to fill this jar so it looked like a basket. It's really cute, it's really pretty, but what they did was they made up a whole new recipe. And I can't say that what the USDA recommended for processing this was enough for the heat to get through this type of a pack. It takes a lot of time to fill a jar like this, and it's just not practical unless the recipe specifies it can be done. So fancy packs, they look pretty, they're very showy, but they're not practical, and we don't recommend them unless it's built into the recipe, such as in this. Cucumber spears for pickles. Asparagus is typically, they're standing straight up and down, whether it's plain asparagus or pickled. Pickled okra, even green beans, and pickled baby carrots, not regular. You can't can baby carrots as just plain carrots. Sorry, it's either sliced or chunks, but not those little baby carrots. So there are instructions for these type of products. All right, let's do question 3, please, Jennifer. All right, this one has got a little story. I live in southeast Kansas where the altitude is 900 feet. But I went to my grandma's house in northwest Kansas where the altitude is 2750. Which altitude should be listed on the label for the fair in southeast Kansas? All right, I think we'll call that good. All right, very good, folks. Yes, the 2750 is what should be on that label. We had about 3% list 900. Nobody picked 1,000, which is good. We did have 1% pick none. No, I'm sorry, that's not an option. We do want to see the altitude. And so, yes, the correct answer is to list the 2750 because that is actually where that product was canned at, even though you live down in southeast Kansas. So, all right, trying to find my mouse here again. So I've seen this show up at a fair where we had a discrepancy on that, and it should have been listed at the higher altitude because they went out to western Kansas to do that. So that is what it should be listed. All right, let me talk about tomatoes. Tomatoes are very special. And if you remember back on my pH chart, tomatoes are right around that 4.6 dividing line. And even though tomatoes taste like they're acidic and sour, the actual pH of them run between a 4.0 and a 5.2. So they're right on that bubble. And so for any kind of tomato that you can, any color of tomato that you can, they have to be acidified. And that is for both boiling water canning and pressure canning. And then this acidification process is a must, no matter which canning method you use, because you do have the options to use one or the other. And that is because the heat treatment, the actual heat lethality treatment between both of those methods, it's the same. It's just that boiling water canning for tomatoes is a longer time at a lower temperature. Pressure canning is a shorter time at a higher temperature, but it's still the same heat lethality that happens. Still have to add the acid. So for pints, you use either bottled lemon juice or citric acid. You do not use fresh lemon juice. Fresh lemon juice has a varying amount of acid content. So you could end up with spoiled tomatoes, and I've seen it. So bottled lemon juice is the choice, or using citric acid, and the amounts are listed there for either pints or quarts. The other option is to use vinegar, but you have to use twice as much as you would lemon juice, and you will taste vinegar in that. And so most often you see either citric acid or lemon juice. So it is important. I have seen fermenting tomatoes, and that jar that's in that picture is an example. I wish I would have taken a video of this, because this jar had bubbles moving on its own inside the jar because there was something growing in there, and liquid was already pushing out. There was liquid around the outside, around the top of the lid when I took the ring off. So gas was already forming, even though the lid was still sealed. but it was on its way to becoming unsealed, and it was fermenting and bubbles were moving on their own. So it is important. So always look for that on the tomato products. Just some examples of things that I've seen. This obviously has a lot of head space. Remember, on tomatoes, it should be a 1/2 inch. This is well under, almost 1.25 inches. So this jar could have been filled a little more with some more tomatoes in it just to get the volume up on it. It's a lot of wasted space on that. This is some tomato juice that is separated. This happens when the tomatoes are not heated fast enough and hot enough to inactivate the enzymes that can cause this separation to happen. Tomato juice instructions will tell you how to quickly heat up the tomatoes so that this doesn't happen. It's still safe to eat, but it just doesn't look right because it's separated out. This particular picture of tomatoes has a lot of bubbles in it, and they're floating. This was a raw pack method, so this is an example of raw pack that floats. And I wonder if the tomatoes, if the bubbles were freed properly in this, because the tomatoes were really pushing up on the lid. So this one's, this one probably would have been better off having a hot pack method on it. And the other thing that could be done is to cut the tomatoes a little smaller so that it helps release some of the air inside the food. This is a jar. Hopefully you can see that black spots underneath the lid. It's either mold or it's corrosion. There is a defect that happens every once in a while on the underside of lids. It's called pinholing. And when acidic products, this happens to be a salsa, react, and you can't see that hole, but if it reacts with the lid, it can cause this black substance to form. There's nothing you can do about it, unfortunately, because you can't see it to start with. It's not going to hurt anything, but it doesn't look right. So the other thing is it could be mold too. That's the other thing, you just don't know. So, all right, question number 4. Let's do this one. Which of these is safely canned? Salsa in a quart jar, green beans in a boiling water bath, strawberry jam inverted, or acidified whole tomatoes in a pressure canner? All right. Still got a few coming in here. All right, let's call that good. All right, the correct answer is D, acidified whole tomatoes in a pressure canner. Now, I see some of you voted for green beans in a boiling water canner. This is plain green beans. They must be pressure canned. There should not be any boiling water bath canned green beans. Same thing, and then also I noticed we got 5% that voted for salsa in a quart jar. No, sorry, I mentioned that a couple times. There are no recipes for putting salsa in a quart jar. Sorry. And nobody voted for the strawberry jam, and that's good. So the correct answer was the acidified whole tomatoes. Very good. Very good. All right. Here's my mouse at. There we are. All right. If you don't mind, I'm going to take a couple minutes here. I might cut the 5 minutes short because I see it's already 8:30 and we need to keep going. So I'm going to make this short and make it about a 2-minute break. So hang with me so I can give my voice a little break, and then we'll get into judging some things, okay? I will be right back. All right, folks, I'm gonna cut the break a couple minutes short so we can keep moving here. So hopefully you all got a sip of a cool, refreshing beverage, and we're gonna get into actually doing a little judging here, kind of like what we did last week. All right, let me find my, get going here. All right. So let me talk about the steps in judging food preservation. Always look at the recipe, double check the label information, make sure they've got everything that needs to be on that label and in the recipe that we've asked for. Check the lid seal, use your finger, push down on the lid. You shouldn't see it bouncing up and down. It should be holding its seal. Take the ring off, check for any residue. Look at the overall appearance of the jar. I mentioned hard water deposits earlier. If it's got that whitish, grayish look to it, it's probably hard water. Suggest to them that they could add some vinegar to their canner water. That way it cleans up the jars as it's processing, and it also cleans up the canner. It can help keep that hard water deposits from building up on the inside of the canner. So that's a real easy way to get your jars nice and clean. The other way you could do it is, you get some vinegar on a paper towel and wash the jars off with that. But the easiest thing is just to put it in the canner water. It's only like a fourth of a cup. You don't even have to measure it. What I do is like 2 pours out of the vinegar bottle. That's what I do. So check the ring, check for rust. Hopefully it comes off the jar. Check around the ring area for any kind of stickiness, any residue, because that can tell you that stuff or food inside the jar probably siphoned out during the processing. So that's something to take note of. They can easily clean that up. Clean up the rings before they even bring it to the fair. So we do require the rings to come on the jars, mainly for transportation, to help prevent any issues of the lid getting bumped and accidentally unsealed. So the rings are needed. Normally at home you can take the rings off and store the jars without the rings. Then get your ruler out, measure the headspace, check the scorecard. It'll tell you how much headspace that you need for whatever you're looking at. And then get your flashlight out and start looking at the product. Rotate the jar, lean it over on its side. I like to lay it down on its side on the table with a towel on it and roll it around and look inside of it with your flashlight and look for defects. Look for things that should not be in there. Look for the size of the pieces. On jams and jellies, look at how it moves or doesn't move, and things like that. And again, on the scorecards, that'll help prompt you on things to look at and ways to improve. Obviously, you want to give comments, good comments, room for improvement, all of that. You really need to do that. And then obviously give them the ribbon placing. So the first thing we're going to look at is some Italian tomatoes. This is a recipe from freshpreserving.com, which is actually the Ball website from last year. So I put that source down at the bottom. These were processed for 40 minutes plus 5 minutes for altitude adjustment because of, and I have to thank Linda, she made this jar of tomatoes, and I know she processed these out in Hayes, America. So I know she adjusted for her altitude. This particular recipe is a basic tomato recipe, and then it has a spice blend added. And if you go look at this, they've got some options on what the spice blends are. So there's an Italian, I think there's like a Greek, and it's really fun, something fun to add. And then the scorecard you would use for this is the tomatoes scorecard. So let's take a look at this video here. So you can see these tomatoes. Again, you want to take the ring off, check the seal, check the inside of the ring, see how clean it looks. And we got a good seal. Now note the date on this. It says September of 18. Any of these fair entries should be made since last year. So this one's a couple years old. Again, we're using the tomatoes publication, measure the headspace. It should be 1/2 inch. And this one's right there. I know it's really hard for you guys to see that. And then get your flashlight out and start looking at this. Hopefully you can see this. I tried to make this as close as I could to my camera. The pieces of the tomatoes are pretty even sized. There's herbs throughout. They're not all sunk to the bottom. I didn't see any tomato skins. You should not see any tomato skins at all. All tomatoes should be peeled. Even salsa, whole tomatoes, whatever it is, you should not see any peels. And this was acidified properly also. That's some of the things to take note on that. There you can see some of the herbs that are in this mixture. So once again, you all get to vote on these tomatoes. So Jennifer, let's put up the poll. Purple, blue, red, or white? What would you give it? This is so cool. I'm glad this is working. It was a harebrained idea I came up with, and I thought, well, let's just try it and see how it goes. So this is fun. I hope this is interactive for you so that you can give some feedback on it. All right. All right, let's call this one good. All right, so we have, let's see, 51% would give it a purple, 43% a blue, 6 a red, nobody gave it a white. Yeah, this one is really good. I really couldn't find anything wrong with it either. I would probably give this one a purple too. And so again, you know, if you can't find anything wrong with this, then I think it does deserve a purple. It's when you start seeing a few little things going wrong, then it's probably not going to be that. So, all right, good, very good. And again, like I said last week, this is your opinion on that day. All right, let's talk about salsa. Just a couple things about salsa. I mentioned about making up your own recipes. Everybody has their own favorite recipe. I get that. But there are a lot of really good tested recipes out there, and that's what needs to be used for canning. If you have your own favorite recipe, my best recommendation is to freeze it, or obviously eat it fresh. Because even if you add some acid to your favorite mixture of vegetables. I mean, this is typically a mixture of tomatoes, which are borderline high and low acid to start with. And then you add peppers and onions and garlic and whatever other low acid vegetables to it. You truly do not know if the amount of vinegar or lemon juice that you're adding is enough. Okay, so use these good recipes that are out there. I have a whole separate publication on this topic, which you can read even more about that. So let me show you some jars of salsa that I've seen at fairs. This one, I don't know if you can see these, but these tomato seeds on here, they're starting to sprout. My guess is these are some tomatoes that have got some age on them. They're probably over mature. Yeah, they're nice, pretty color, but we really shouldn't see any sprouting going on with the seeds on there. The size of the other pieces of food in there look really good. So that's something that was kind of obvious to me. This particular jar of salsa is a little off color. Now this one could be because of a mixture of tomatoes. They might have used some yellows and oranges in there, or even some underripe red tomatoes. But the other thing that's even more concerning to me on this was in a 24-ounce jar, which is a 1.5 pints. Again, there are no salsa recipes for anything bigger than a pint. And so this one got disqualified. The sprouting tomato seed ones, I would just drop that down a ribbon, okay? Just to kind of give you an idea of what to look at on that. All right, the other thing about this off color too is it could be maybe some spoilage going on in there too, but the biggest problem is the size of the jar on this. All right, so here's a salsa. This is Mrs. Wage's salsa. Very simple, tomatoes, their mix, and then it has vinegar in it. Their processing is 40 minutes, and 5 minutes was added for the altitude. So this is their salsa mix. Again, you would use the tomato scorecard for this. And so let's take a look at this. All right, so again, we're looking at look at that ring, make sure it's clean, check the seal, make sure it's got a good seal. And then again, we're using the tomato scorecard. The head space on this one, again, it should be 1/2 inch. This one could be filled up just a little bit more. The head space is just a little bit too much. This is a good mix. Obviously, you're just using tomatoes, and the whatever else is in there, that's peppers that's in the Mrs. Wage's mix in there. And I don't know if you can see this, but there were a few bubbles in there. Even with salsa, it's a good idea to use the bubble freer to get the bubbles out. The tomato pieces should be pretty even in size, no big chunks, no little chunks. These should have a nice chop to them. And then the consistency of it should have some body to it. It shouldn't be runny, but it also should not be overly thick either. So I think this one has some nice movement to it. All right, so let's pick a ribbon on this one. All right, let's call that good. Very good. Yeah, 85% of you picked a blue ribbon. I'll agree with you on that. And because of that headspace, a few bubbles in that product, but otherwise, you know, for the most part, it was good, but just needed a little fine tuning on that. 4% picked a purple, 12% picked a red, and nobody picked a white. So yeah, I would agree with you on that. And that's my salsa. I made that. So I'll take that blue. I'm good with that. So, all right. All right, let's go on to the next one, which is pie filling. Now, pie filling, obviously it's fruit. And the key about pie filling is the starch that's used for canning is called clear gel. We should not see any pie filling using standard cornstarch. The picture in the middle is an apple pie filling made using standard cornstarch, and you can see how cloudy and clumpy it gets. Over storage time, it tends to separate. You can kind of see a liquid separating on the top of that. The headspace is something else on there. It's just a poor quality product. Standard cornstarch does not hold up very well to the canning process. Clear gel is also a cornstarch, but it's just a different type. And the bottom right picture is also apple pie filling, and it's made with clear gel. Now the brown color is from the spices, but it has a clear gel, and that's why it's called clear gel. So the type that you have to use is the cook type clear gel. There is an instant type. You don't want to buy that. You want the cook type. This can be a little tricky to find. There are some bulk food stores that sell this. For those of you around the Hutchinson area, down on the Glenn's Bulk Foods off of Highway 50, they sell it. This particular package in this picture is at a general store over in St. Mary's. They sell it there. You can obviously find it on the internet. And there's probably a couple other locations I just don't know about. I think there's one up in Sabetha. I think somebody told me. There's a store up there that sells it. So that is what you need to use for making pie filling. So we're going to look at a cherry pie filling, and this is the recipe that's in our K-State publication. It's also a USDA recipe. So this uses fresh shower cherries, sugar, clear gel, water, lemon juice to give it a little bit of acidity, and then the spices. And so this one you would use the fruits, the canned fruits scorecard. It was processed for 30 minutes plus 5 minutes for altitude on this. All right, so this is the cherry pie filling, and you'll note, yeah, hopefully you can tell on this. This jar is one of those 1.5 jars, the 24-ounce jars. So when you use this, which you can do on pie filling, you can use this as a quart jar. And again, note, hopefully you saw the date on there, it was back in July of 18. So it's time for this to get used up. The pie filling headspace should be 1 inch. So we get out our ruler and it is spot on. That is awesome. So then we get out our flashlight, take a look at the texture, the color, the suspension of the cherries in there. Really nice color on it. It's got a little bit of looseness, but I think because of the extra long storage time, this is starting to gel and a little bit of separation happening. If you can see, it's a little more liquid on the outer edges and more of a blob, lack of a better word, in the middle. It's time to get this used, but it's got a really nice color in it. There are a few air bubbles in it. It's really hard to get the air bubbles out of this because of the thickness of this product. Still, it's a good idea to put a bubble freer down the middle of this to help get rid of some of those air bubbles. But otherwise, it's a really pretty red color and pretty nice product. I like how the cherries are suspended in this, so not too bad. Headspace is great. All right, so let me get my ribbon up here. So let's pick a ribbon for this one. All right, let's call that good. Yeah, 59% of you voted for the blue ribbon. I would agree with that. 23% purple, 18 picked a red, nobody picked a white. So yeah, I'd go with the blue ribbon on this. And again, just as a reminder, these products should have been made since last year, since the last fair. Okay, that's the timeline that we look for on that. And then because of the separation, you know, the blob in the middle and it's starting to separate out a little bit. So otherwise, I'm sure it's a perfectly good product to use in a really good cherry pie. So, all right, let's go to the next one. Peaches, halved or sliced. Pretty simple. It's peaches in a syrup. You can use plain water if you so choose. Sugar is for sweetness. It does help with preserving the texture and the color of the fruit itself. But if you're somebody that's watching your sugar intake, you can use plain water or even apple juice or grape juice if you so choose. These can be packed either raw pack or hot pack. And I will tell you, these were done hot pack. They were processed for 20 minutes plus 5 minutes for altitude. So this is from our instructions in our publication on peaches. So again, we use the fruits, the canning fruits publication, or canning fruits scorecard, I mean. So this is a pint jar. These can be done in either pints or quarts. It could be the in-between size of that, again, that 1.5 pints. Rings looks pretty good. Got a good seal on this. We're looking for a 1/2 inch of headspace on this. Again, double check your scorecard. It'll tell you that. And yeah, it's a little bit low. Could fill up the juice. And again, the juice should cover the top of the fruit. And that helps protect the fruit from discoloring on the top during storage in that headspace area. Over time, sometimes that can happen if the fruit is peaking up above the juice. So the color is good on this. There's no floating. These peaches were halved and then quartered to get more peaches in the jar. Again, these were hot packed. Now the peaches look a little rough. It's just the handling of the peaches. So the edges aren't as clean as they probably could be. But the cooking process is going to soften them up some before you put them in the jar. Again, look for, you don't want to see any peels. You don't want to see any stems, any pit pieces in there either. And I don't see any of that. All right. I think we're done there. So let's pick a ribbon. All right, let's call that good. All right, we had 5% of purple, 59% of blue, 36% of red, and nobody gave a white. Yeah, I'd be okay with a blue on that. I might be kind of pushing a little bit because of the headspace was a little big. Honestly, I'd probably leave it. I'm going to be hard on myself because these are my peaches. I'd probably give myself a red on these. I struggle with canning peaches, and so I was proud that I even got a jar that did not float. Personally, what I've found is cutting them into smaller pieces also helps prevent them from floating, and that's why I put quarters in them, or cut them into quarters, I mean. So, but otherwise the color is good on them. The no skins, no pit pieces, no stems, anything like that. So, all right, very good. All right, let's move on to the next one. We've got a couple jelly products. So let me quickly talk about a couple things about jams and jellies. We should not see any paraffin wax. This is an old method, and honestly, it can help mold to grow. It's an old way of preserving jam and jelly, so we should not see that anymore. These need to be water bathed, which will help prevent mold from growing. Should also not see any inverted jars. I've talked about that a couple times now. If you're using regular pectin, the sugar should not be altered. The only time it can be altered is if they're using a low or no sugar pectin. So that's the exception to that. And the other thing is not doubling recipes. If you think you're going to save time by doubling a recipe to make a large batch of jam or jelly, you're probably going to end up with pancake syrup. So I really don't recommend you doing that. Just make one recipe at a time for the best results. This is some peach jam. Looks more like jelly with just a few little pieces of peaches in it that have really floated to the top. So I think this could use a lot more peaches. This is a lot of headspace. This could be filled up a lot more too. So yeah, the fruit floats. Peaches tend to do that. Strawberries tend to do that. So that's something to look for. You want, on a jam, you want to see the fruit pieces from top to bottom. You shouldn't see any separation like this. This is a jalapeno jelly. I turned it upside down so that you can see how this one separated. The pulp matter really floated, and you had this clear green part. Now, note also on this, for jalapeno jelly is often colored with artificial color. That is about the only time artificial coloring is used. You should not see artificial coloring used anywhere else, like in pickles, for example. So because that's not part of that. That's not part of those recipes. This is the exception to that, to get that bright green jelly color, green color for the jelly. So anyway, so that's a jalapenos. That one, the pulp really floated on that one. This is a raspberry jam. Lots of seeds on this. These seeds could be taken out using a strainer or a food mill to help get rid of some of those seeds, and you can see some of the floating. And when you turn it on its side, it's really loose. For a jam, it should not be this loose, and it's separating. And the color on this is really dull. Now, I will tell you, my neighbor gave me this jar of jam, and I happened to notice the date that was on the top of the jar, which was much appreciated, but it was already 2 years old when she gave it to me. I don't think she understood what I did for a living, so I appreciated the gift, but I never ate this product. But it's a great show and tell product, that's for sure. So I don't have it anymore, but I did take pictures, so it lives on. So the color is really off on this too. It could be a lot brighter. All right, so let's look at some cherry jelly. This jelly was made with liquid pectin. The recipe calls for 3 cups of sour cherry juice, which you could get your cherry juice made from your own cherries if you wanted to. An easy alternative to that is to buy 100% juice. And that's what this particular jelly was made with, is 100% sour cherry juice. I don't recommend using those juices that have the added sugars in them, because that can throw off the balance between the juice, the sugar, and the pectin. But this is an easy way to do this. So we have a scorecard for sweet spreads. This is a recipe from the University of Georgia, off of their website. And so this one's processed, increased 5 minutes for the altitude. So let's take a look at this. You can see the date on the side. Now, I'll admit this one was made in one of my food preservation classes, so that's why the label looks like that. Again, we got a nice clean ring on there, good seal on this. Again, look at your scorecard for jams and jellies. The headspace should be 1/4 inch. I don't know if anybody of you use Sure-Gel. In the past, they used to say 1/8 inch. I think they've changed that to 1/4. It should all be 1/4. So this has got too much headspace. They could have filled this up a little more. The other thing to look for is foam. You don't want to see a bunch of foam on top. That should be taken off before it's put in the jar, because that can interfere with the seal. Turn it on its side, get your flashlight in there. It should be nice and clear. This one does have a little bit of bubbling down at the bottom. It's really hard to prevent that from happening. A lot of it is extra stirring. Just try not to over stir it too much after it's been cooked. Look at the set on it. It should wiggle a little bit. Jelly shouldn't be stiff. If it's stiff, it's probably been overcooked. And so wiggle it, see if it moves. This one's gotten a little bit stiff. It's not moving too much. But otherwise, for the most part, it's pretty clear. And it's got a nice, pretty color to it. All right. Having trouble finding my mouse again. Hello. Where are you? Sorry. There we go. Let's do it that way. Okay. Me and my mouse are not getting along today. If that's the only technical difficulty I have, I'll call that a win. All right. All right, a couple more. All right, let's call that good. Yeah, this is almost a dead heat here. We have 3% that picked a purple, 46% picked a blue, and 51% picked a red. I'd probably give this a red too. Nobody picked a white. Because of the too much headspace, it really didn't move very much, even though that it's got a pretty color, nice gel. Still, and just a little bit of tiny bubbles down at the bottom, but not horribly bad. So yeah, I would agree with the red on that. Good. All right. Oh, come on. There it is. All right, I'll get to it here. All right, now we have a jam. This is a spiced plum jam made with fresh red plums. It's been spiced with cinnamon, cloves, allspice, and then powdered pectin. This has 4 cups of sugar in it. This is a Sure-Gel recipe, and so, and then it was processed with an extra 5 minutes for altitude. And so this jam, let's take a look at this one. And notice the lid on this. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen this style lid for a long time. That's something to take note of. It looks really pretty though. And again, we're looking at 1/4 of an inch of head space. The ring looked good. The seal is good. The head space on it just could be filled up just a little bit more. It's just get a little more product in that jar. There's no foam on the top. And always look at the underside of the lid. Remember back on that salsa, you might see some, hopefully not see any mold growing up there, but that is something to look at. So again, on a jam, you should see pulp throughout the whole mixture. It should not be separating. This is really dense. You're not going to see your flashlight through this entire jar, but you know, try to look at as much as you can, even stick it down at the bottom so that you can maybe see what's down there. Roll it around, wiggle it. Sometimes you could even shake the darn thing and see if it'll move that way. But this is a little bit stiff, so that's something to take note of on that. All right, let's pick a ribbon. All right, let's call that good. All right, we have 1% of purple, we have 36% blue, and 60% red, and 3% white. I'd go with the red on this too. I would agree with y'all on that. And because a little bit of stiffness, could have used a little more fill on it. The lid, I'm not sure where that came from, because you really just don't really see those much anymore. So anyway, good. I would agree with the red on that. All right, let's get into pickles a little bit. Oh, let me take that away. So, so let me show you some pictures of pickles. This is a sweet pickle relish. I have highlighted here, note the processing time was 2.5 hours. Now, I think there was a little misunderstanding on this. And they probably put 2.5 hours as the whole time it took to actually make this product. Really what we're looking for here is the processing time of in the water bath canner. So, so yeah, that was a little misunderstanding. Now it looks like somebody opened this up and ate some. There's way too much headspace on this. Headspace on all your pickle products should be 1/2 inch. So, and this was a really thick relish too. That was the other thing. So yeah, there were a multitude of issues on this particular jar. All right, this is some whole pickles. Sometimes you'll see cucumbers shrivel. If you can see the little wrinkles in this, it's likely due to cucumbers that were picked and then not pickled right away. If you leave them set in the refrigerator for 2 or 3 days, they do start to lose moisture and they will shrivel. So that is something to take note of. These really need to be pickled the day they're picked. That is the best thing to do. So the other thing on this is it's a little full. They could have cut down these cucumbers a little bit. The other thing to look for on these whole pickles like this, or even on spears, is make sure they remove the blossom end of the cucumber, because there is an enzyme in that blossom end that can cause softening. So that needs to be trimmed off. It's just a little 1/16 inch slice taken off on that. Can also see some corrosion at the top. It looks like the vinegar solution might have boiled. Because it's so full, it got in between the seal and the rim of the jar on this. So, all right. And actually the liquid doesn't cover the top of the cucumbers either. So they're starting to discolor at the top too. This is a jar of pickled beets. If you can see the white sediment here, I turned this jar upside down so that you could see this. This was pickled beets where they used iodized regular table salt. You should always use pickling salt when you're pickling because it is pure salt. Iodized salt will do this. It has an anti-caking ingredient that does not dissolve, and it will settle out over time. And so you end up with this white sediment at the bottom of the jars. So I know that because that's what was on the recipe. The other thing that if you don't know, if you see this and it's not indicated on the recipe, it could be a sign of spoilage too. So that's the other thing about that. But always use pickling salt. This is a tomatillo relish, really super thick and way too much headspace. Again, this is one like my beginning slide, that really thick salsa. It did not move. And there were some bubbles in this too. So this is super thick. And the processing probably did not even get through the middle of the jar of this. Looks nice, pretty color. So this is a mixed pickles. This was a made up recipe. This one showed up at the state fair. And the recipe basically said, just throw whatever vegetables you have in the jar, add water to cover the top. They've got some dill in there. They got some garlic down at the bottom, and I think maybe some spices. And then they only added like a tablespoon or 2 of vinegar. This is completely, should not have even come to the state fair at all. This was a recipe, an old time recipe. And so this one got easily disqualified. The other part at the top of the jar, which you can't see very well, there's a lot of residue because it was so full that the jar siphoned, and there was a lot of residue at the top of the jar. So it was messy. It was really messy. All right. And there was no recipe source on it either. Very little processing done on this too. All right, so let's look at a summer squash relish. This is made with yellow squash and or zucchini. And it's got some onion in it, vinegar, sugar, and then some spices. This is a recipe from University of Georgia. This is one that they created. It's got a 15-minute plus 5 minutes for altitude processing. So you'll use the pickled products scorecard on this. This is canned in half pints. So that is the size of jar that you see here. So let's take a look at this. So the squash is shredded. You could use all yellow or all regular zucchini. Good seal. Now notice a little bit of damage on the top of the lid there, a little bit of residue. Again, we're looking for a 1/2 inch headspace on pickled products. So we get out our ruler and measure that. Now this is The surface of this is a little uneven. I'm going to call it good on the 1/2-inch headspace. It's because it's the type of product that it is. It's really hard to see that even 1/2 inch all the way through. But this has got a little bit of movement in it. The liquid should be completely through the entire product. It shouldn't look dry on the top. You shouldn't see any bubbles on there. I think it's a pretty mix between the yellow and the zucchini. Look for the mixture. You should see mustard seeds throughout also, because that's in the product. They shouldn't be all at the bottom. So this is a pretty decent looking jar. All right, let's give it a ribbon. Okay, let's call that good. So we have 29% picked a purple, 62 a blue, 9% a red, nobody a white. Yeah, I'd probably give it a blue. It's got a few bubbles in it. So again, on these types of products, you do need to use the bubble freer to make sure you get the bubbles out, so that you don't have any excess air inside of there. All right, oops, let me get rid of the, there we go. Okay, let's move on to vegetables. These are some plain beets. These are pressure canned beets, and you notice the color on these. Now, this could be a couple things. This could be the variety of beet that it is. There are some varieties that are a little more pale in color than your standard red, bright red, deep red color. So it could be that, or it could be that they cut off the stem and the root of the beet too much before they were pre-cooked to peel them. And that's going to cause the color to bleed out. And then you'll end up with these pale looking beets on there. Safety wise, it's not a problem. If they're supposed to be a bright red, that's what you want to see on that. So that's just something to take note of. So let's look at some carrots. Again, carrots are sliced or diced. They're not the baby carrot size. They're not whole carrots. So they need to be pretty evenly cut. Usually the slices are around a 1/2 inch. You don't have to measure them, eyeball them. And you just want to see a consistent look to it. Not a bunch of small pieces, not a bunch of huge pieces. Carrots can be canned either raw or hot packed. And so that is an option on these. On plain vegetables and on meats, and actually in tomatoes, like plain tomatoes, salt is optional. It's only for flavor. So salt can be left out. That is an option on this. And again, the headspace should be 1 inch. So we'll use the vegetables scorecard. And let's take a look at these. Again, the ring should come off pretty easily. And okay, show it. Just a tiny bit of rust, a little bit of corrosion on there. Good seal on this. Again, we're looking for 1 inch of headspace. So we get our ruler out and we take a look at that. And hopefully you can see that. If anything, it might be just a hair low, not too bad, but the liquid is pretty much covering the tops of the carrots. I don't know if you can see on top of the lid there, there's an R on top of there. That means these carrots were raw packed. So we should hopefully not see any floating. Again, the pieces should look pretty uniform. Turn it on its side and look on the inside. Shouldn't see any peels. There are some small slices in there, so it's a little bit uneven on the cut. And the color on this is starting to get a little bit dull. These are probably getting a little bit old. It's time to get them used. The color can change over storage time. But otherwise, at least they're not floating. I've seen some really bad floating carrots before. So that is one thing to look at. So let's give it a ribbon. Thanks for hanging in there with me, everybody. We're getting close to the end, so. And then I know you have questions. All right, let's call that good. All right, we have 1% of purple, 36% blue, 63% of red, and nobody of white. Yeah, I would agree with the red. You know, it's acceptable, but there's some room for improvement on that, and I think I made note of what those things could be. All right, good. All right. Meat. So this is something not everybody does, but there are more people that do this than you think. This particular picture is beef. Meat, this is in chunks. And this, in this style, when it's in chunks or strips, it can be packed either hot pack or raw pack. So the picture on the left, the jar on the left, is the hot pack method. So the meat is basically seared a little bit before it's packed, and then you put it in the jar and you add water, or you could use meat broth on top of it. You want to see as lean of meat as possible. You don't want to see a whole lot of fat. A little bit at the top, which you see here in this jar on the left, that is acceptable. It's when there's a whole ton of fat in there. The fat can tend to crawl up the sides of the jars and interfere with the seal. So that's why you want it as lean as possible. You will see sediment at the bottom. That's bottom of the jars. That's just the nature of meat. And it'll have that good cooked color to it. The jar on the right is a raw pack. This is where the meat is put into the jar raw, loosely, no added liquid. So you fill up the jar, you measure the head space, which is 1 inch, but you notice on the raw pack method, it shrinks a lot. And so the head space changes quite a bit. For this, that is normal, okay? And that's noted on the scorecard, so that's a reminder for you if you do see this. So really, when you're canning meat, really the hot pack is really the best way to go. You get a better pack. The meat gets covered with liquid, and you get more meat in the jar too. So it really is a better way to go. Now, this particular jar happens to be squirrel. And this one was a new one to me. I've seen recipe for it. There are recipes. So Easy to Preserve has it in there. You can it like chicken. This one caught me off guard. This is an entire squirrel, obviously no head. It was skinned. This young man, he shot it, he cleaned it, and that whole squirrel went into this pint jar. He did everything right. Now, the one thing that did not quite work so well, and it's probably a little hard for you to see, is there's just a tiny bit of fur still in that jar, and that's what I've circled here. So that is what I would call a foreign material. We really don't want to see any fur inside the jar. So I did count down on this. This is a bone-in product. So when you look at the canning directions, bone-in product for this is processed 10 minutes less than boneless. So kudos to him for doing this. You know, it was great. It was great. It caught the attention of a lot of people. So anyway, it was fun. It was fun. That young man, he knew what he was doing. Just needed to clean that fur up a little bit. All right, so let's judge a jar of meat here. This is strips, cubes, or chunks. This can be, like I mentioned earlier, can be done hot or raw pack. You want lean meat. Salt is optional. So this has to be done in a pressure canner. This was a weighted gauge canner, and for the altitude, essentially if you're using a weighted gauge canner and you are above 1,000 feet, you will always use 15 pounds of pressure. It's an easy way to remember that. All right, so let's take a look at this jar. And this is a raw packed jar of cubes. And again, you want to look at the ring and check the seal on this. There's our note that it's cubes and it's a raw packed. And again, you are going to see an expanded amount of headspace because of the shrinkage that happens, and that is normal on this particular product. The fat on there, I think, is acceptable. So this is pretty lean. There's really a nice amount of juice on there. This meat created a nice amount of juice for itself. Again, you want to turn it on its side. Look at the size of the pieces. They should be uniform. You shouldn't see any bones in this. You shouldn't see any gristle. So you want to look for that. If you've ever had home canned meat like this, it is delicious. It really, really is good. Doesn't look so pretty, but it really is quite tasty. So good color on this. The sediment is normal. And again, you can use water or you can use like beef broth since this is beef. So that is an option on this. All right, so let's pick a ribbon. All right, let's call that good. All right, we've got 54% of purple, 38% of blue, 8% of red, no whites. Yeah, I'd probably lean for purple on this one too. That's really pretty good, and especially for raw packed. I don't know if you noticed on the picture before of the two jars, sometimes you'll see raw packed meat that just doesn't get enough liquid in it on its own to cover the meat itself. But this one was really quite good, and the pieces of the meat were pretty even, and so yeah, I would agree with you on that. All right, just a few more things to go through. I want to quickly mention dry dehydrated foods because you will probably see some of these. It's a real simple way of preserving food. It doesn't take a whole lot of space, doesn't require refrigeration, does take some time because you're pulling moisture out of these foods, and that helps prevent growth of microorganisms and also slows enzyme activity. And it's really kind of a fun way to preserve food. You'll often see fruit leathers. That's pretty popular. I don't think I've ever seen any vegetable leather, but that is an option. These should be pliable. If you know what fruit roll-ups look like, that's kind of the texture that you're looking for. So they should be dry but pliable, not sticky, no visible moisture. They're usually exhibited inside of a canning jar, at least 3 pieces. They're usually rolled up with plastic wrap to help keep them from sticking. But that plastic wrap should peel apart. You can take those out of the jar and look at those. I don't have a problem with doing that. That way you can check the texture on that. So you have the option to do that. It's the canned products that I really don't want you to open. And you can look at the thickness of the product, and if it's got seeds in it, like strawberry seeds, they should be uniform. Fruit does need to be pre-treated to prevent browning. Typically ascorbic acid like fruit fresh is used, or fruit juice. I don't think you'll ever see sulfites. That's something that's used commercially. You might see a honey dip in So Easy to Preserve. They talk about that. But the fruit pieces should be sliced thin and even. You might see the peel on some fruits such as apples or peaches, which can be done. It just might take a little longer for those to dry. But they should be even sliced. They should bend, not crack, not be brittle. If they're brittle like that, they're too dry. But they should bend, no visible moisture. Shouldn't see any bugs on the inside or anything like that. Vegetables, most of them do need to be blanched, either by steam blanching or water blanching. Some exceptions would be like onions or peppers. Those are typically don't require blanching. They should be brittle, crisp, and they should be entered in a like a half pint canning jar. Shake the jar, they should rattle. They should be uniform, and so you shouldn't see any visible moisture on any of these dried products on the inside of the jar. So that's some tips on vegetables. Herbs is really popular, most commonly dried in a dehydrator. Microwave drying is possible as long as they don't get burnt. So it's kind of tricky just knowing how your microwave works. Or they could be air dried. You could put them in a paper bag with some holes in them and let them air dry. But the dehydrator makes it really easy. And this is, I believe this might be oregano, I think. And so you leave the leaves on the stems when they're small like this so they don't fall through the holes. And then you strip them off after they're dried. Big leaves, you just lay them on the rack with big leaves on them. So, all right. Jerky, I mentioned this earlier that you have to see how they heat treated it. All jerky needs to be heat treated, and this is not the dehydrating temperature. This is because the optimum dehydrating temperature is 140 degrees. So meat needs to be heated up to 160 because we want to make sure we kill any potential E. coli that could be there. So there's two ways to do that. And we have a publication on making jerky, which details this out, and you can read through this. But essentially there's two methods. One is either to heat the strips of meat in the marinade prior to drying. It's a quick heat on top of the stove, and then you continue with the dehydrating. The other way is to go ahead and dehydrate your jerky, take it out of the dehydrator, put it on a cookie sheet in the oven at 275 for 10 minutes, and that will get the temperature up to where it needs to be. One of those methods has to be on the recipe, and they have to do that. I have seen incidences of improperly heat-treated jerky in foodborne illness recalls, so it can happen, and I don't want to see that happen. So these publications here, this 3173, that's the dehydrating jerky publication that I'm talking about. We do have scorecards for all these dried products. The one on the left is fruits and leathers. The one on the right is dried vegetables. And then we have one for herbs and one for jerky. So again, these will help guide you through the judging process of all of these products on that. So take them with you. If you haven't got enough education tonight, there's even more. And I know this is a lot of stuff that I've thrown at you. So again, go to my website. University of Georgia has a youth publication called Put It Up. It's a great it has lesson plans in it. If any of you are foods leaders, you could use this in the foods project and do classes with this, because it gives you the whole lesson plan, what to buy, how long it takes, everything. It's really quite good. I recommend looking at that. Again, the website, this is my website with the fair judging section on it. We'll get this recording posted up there tomorrow. The presentation slides are there, and then all these other publications that I've been talking about here tonight, those are all there, including the copies of the labels are there too, to help make it easier to find those. Again, I want to thank my video producer. He really worked hard. He did everything I asked him to. He did not get to eat that piece of pie. That was all me on that one. So, but it was fun doing this, and it was fun to put this together. And I hope this has been useful for you. So again, if you have any questions about any of this, you're welcome to email me, or if you can't find my email, check with your agent or email any of us, and we can help you out. All right, I know it's 9:34.
Yes.
So if there's questions.
Okay. And Beth wanted to mention real quick about the survey that was going to come out real quick. So I'll unmute her real quick.
Yeah, so while Jennifer's looking up the questions, just a reminder to all of you that we will be sending you a survey, and we are going to want your feedback on what you thought about this experience and what we could do for the future. So just be watching for that, and we really would appreciate you sending that back in once you get it.
Yeah. All comments, good and bad, are welcome.
Okay, so where can someone get, or what is it called so they can find it, the book for Ball or Kerr, Recipes for Canning? Where could they find that book?
Those are pretty widely available. You can find those, grocery stores, Walmart, Target, Bed Bath & Beyond. I think I've seen them there, or hardware stores that sell canning equipment. Even like, I think even Menards might sell it. So there's a wide variety of places. If nothing else, order it off online. I know Amazon sells it. Yeah, wide variety, and they're pretty cheap. They're only like maybe $5-7 or something like that. They're really not that expensive. So yeah, it's a good resource.
Okay. How does bacteria work in sugar-free jams and jellies? Those are such as those for people with diabetes.
So again, those products, they do need to be water bathed, just like all other jams and jellies. The reduced sugar content, one thing about those, sometimes you'll see a looser set with that. As long as it's been processed properly, there really is a very low risk of any kind of bacteria issues with the reduced sugar products. You know, the pectin will have just a little bit of sugar in there. It's not completely free of sugar. And obviously you're going to use the low or no sugar pectins with them. Sometimes there's a little bit of dextrose in there. The other trick about those low or no sugar pectins is they have a calcium ingredient, and that's what helps form the gel. Again, they have to be water bathed, just like every other type of jam or jelly, and they'll be perfectly fine. Pretty low risk.
Okay, so even the 4.6 to 7 pH that have vinegar added can't be put in a boiling water canner.
Well, now, okay, good question. So vegetables, let's talk about green beans. Okay, so plain green beans, you're canning green beans in water. Those must be pressure canned. You know, the pH on those is around a 5 or 6, if I recall right off the top of my head. Now, if you're making pickled green beans, that's when you add a vinegar solution to them. Yes, it is still green beans, but because you're adding that vinegar to them, that makes it an acidified food. And so pickled green beans can be water bath. Same thing with plain beets versus pickled beets, or plain carrots versus pickled carrots. All those plain vegetables have to be pressure canned. It's when you add vinegar to them that makes them pickled, and so those can be water bath canned. So that's the difference on that.
Okay. Do exhibitors have to include the recipe card with their exhibits, and what happens if they don't?
Yes, they do. That is required. And if they don't, they will be disqualified, because that is written in the rules. Because otherwise, even though, you know, at the county level, yes, you're talking to the kids, you still need to have the recipe. But it's especially important at the state fair level, because we do not get to talk to the kids at all. And unless they just happen to show up when we're judging their product, and that's happened, but county level and state level, it is required. It has to be there.
Okay. Why is mashed pumpkin a disqualification?
We don't have any tested recipes for mashed pumpkin. Mashed pumpkin is a very, very thick product. And they've tried to do some studies to get a consistent processing done with that type of product, and that's really difficult to do. Even if it's just, and then if I remember right, they were looking at like plain mashed pumpkin, you know, just a canned plain mashed pumpkin. And to get the heat to process evenly through that thick product consistently in every round of testing, it's not worked out. That is one product that I have requested with the Ball folks. When we were there in February, they asked us what are some recipe ideas that they could work on for us, because they have the capabilities of doing that and they have the money. That's something we don't have. And so that is one thing that I've asked them. So hopefully maybe they can figure it out and figure out a safe way to make those products.
Okay, so another question about proper recipe sources. They have a Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations with recipes such as mango pickles, etc. And they also have an ortho all about pickling, wanting to know if those are things they should use personally or not.
Well, honestly, I haven't seen those. Now the ortho ones, I just don't know. I don't know. I'd have to actually kind of take a look at those to see. If they could send me an examples of those, I could maybe look into that a little bit. But honestly, I've never seen those, so that's something new to me.
Okay. How old can the Ball Blue Book be? They have one from '94 and one from 2007 copyright.
Okay, so anything from 1994 to the present. So both of those should be fine. Okay. Yeah.
So you can use Mrs. Wages. A couple years ago, they got disqualified for using it.
Yes, you can use Mrs. Wages. You just have to follow their directions. Okay. Where it might have gotten disqualified is they didn't process it properly. Like I mentioned, I've seen that come through where Mrs. Wages says to process their salsa for 40 minutes and they decided to process for only 20 minutes. That will get disqualified. So you got to follow their directions and they'll be just fine.
Okay. If we have a home recipe, can we send them in to see if they are okay?
If you have a home recipe, that is possible. We do have to have a sample, not just the recipe. And that's a good question. And because it is really difficult to actually look at a recipe and truly see if it is a safe recipe for canning. because of all the variables that I talked about. You can't see the pH. You can't see the water activity by looking at the recipe. Yeah, you can see all the ingredients. We can kind of guess and kind of get in the ballpark based on products that we've tested. But unless we actually have a sample of it, then we truly do not know. So that's the thing about that, is we'd have to have the recipe and sample so we can actually test it.
Okay.
And there may be a cost to it also. Don't ask me what that is, because I can't think what that is right off the top of my head.
Okay. Are there any other lids that could be used? The ball and cur lids are getting really expensive and they don't last very long.
Well, those lids, they say they should stay usable for 5 years. And really, they are the best lids that are out there that I know of. I talked about those plastic lids. I'm not a big fan of those because of the potential seal failures. And then the other off-brand lids, I can't guarantee those are going to seal as well. As long as you use them properly, they should work just fine. Again, you don't have to heat them up. You just wash them in soapy water, make sure they're clean, and let them dry, and then just use them like that. You don't have to preheat them. But if you do, just don't boil them. Just put them in some hot water. That's it. Just to slightly heat them up. But as long as you've used them right, they should work just fine.
Okay. Somebody's curious about how many youth actually can still.
How many youth?
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you the last few state fairs, we've averaged around, Diane, help me, around 250 entries or so. Is that about right? I think that's around about what we see at the state fair. You know, it varies by county. We'll see some counties that may only have 2 or 3 jars. And then other counties, I've judged at. I've been the judge for food preservation, and I've been there all day. So it varies widely. So it's still being done, and I'm glad. But yeah, the average at the state fair level is around 250.
Yeah, you're right. Thanks, Karen. Jennifer had to unmute me, so.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Someone was a little late, so they wanted you to clarify using extracts in recipes. Some are alcohol extracts, but not drinking alcohol, correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, same rule applies that from regular foods. You know, a vanilla extract, for example, would be fine, but not hard alcohol, no beer, no wine, no hard alcohol.
Okay. Can you can pumpkin butter in Sure-Gel with Sure-Gel in it?
Honestly, I don't know if I've seen such a thing, but my guess is no. That would make a really thick product, so I'm not sure that would be, I don't know. I've never seen a recipe for that, so I can't say for sure. Good question.
Okay. What about Anchor brand jars?
Now, the thing about some of those off brands is the actual size of them might be measured a little differently from the standard, like half pint size jars that we see from Ball and Kerr. Some of these off-brand jars might be more metric. Honestly, I don't know what Anchor's is for sure. But they might not be a full pint, or they might not be a half pint, so they might measure a little differently. So I haven't seen any of those around here, so I would still stick with the Ball and Kerr and the Golden Harvest brands.
Okay. When you judge canned meat and okra, what is okay and not okay when you lose liquid during the canning process?
Well, it does happen sometimes. If siphoning happens, the main thing is, was it processed right? The process time, the process method. If it did lose some because of siphoning, is the seal still good? Is the jar messy? Things like that. Those types of jars, hopefully you don't see those show up at a fair. But if you have some of those at home, everything's been done right, but sometimes it happens. Sometimes the siphoning happens because, especially in pressure canning, the fluctuation of the pressure. So you got to get that pressure settled in as soon as possible when you're getting the canner going, and getting it to settle in to where the pressure needs to be. The less it moves, the less chance of siphoning. And again, it also depends on, how full the jar is, make sure the headspace is right. And so if you do have a loss of headspace or a loss of liquid, use those jars up first. I would also put those in the refrigerator, after they've cooled off, and use those up first, just to be on the safe side. And don't bring them to the fair.
Okay, do you have a specific recommendation for the altimeter apps? They're seeing a lot of them.
Oh yeah, there's a whole lot of them. I think the one I downloaded was actually called Altimeter, Altimeter. So there's a whole lot of them out there. So whatever one it looks easy to use. I just happened to find that one and I tried it and I was like, oh, this is cool, works for me. So, the other thing you can do too, the tricky part is in some counties, they're right on that bubble where they're 1,000 feet or under 1,000 feet. Those are the ones that are really tricky. Or if you're at the 2,000 level, are you above 2,000 or below 2,000? Sometimes that makes a difference. So, yeah, it's the counties that are on the bubbles like that where it can be a little tricky. But otherwise, it's going 500 feet increments when you look at the charts. Roughly. So anyway, you can always look at an old-fashioned map. That's the other thing to look at. Or look it up on the internet.
Okay, they went to a Missouri Extension talk and they had a water bath canner that was more like a steamer. What about those?
Okay. My guess is that was probably what's called a steam canner. And that is an acceptable way to can a water bath processing. And I didn't bring that one up, I should have. And so I'm glad you brought that up. Steam canners use a small amount of water. It kind of looks like an upside down water bath canner, essentially. At least some of the brands do. And so the base is only about 2 to 3 inches high, and then there's a dome that fits over the jars. So the water is in the bottom, and it generates steam, obviously, when you heat it up. This is only for water bath processed foods of 45 minutes or less total processing time, including altitude adjustment. And I have information about that in the how-to guide for water bath canning. I do talk about steam canners in there. So it can be done, but again, it's only for products, foods that are processed a total of 45 minutes or less. Otherwise, you run out of water. That's why. And you can't open it up and add more water. So that's why on that. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I forgot all about that.
Okay, what have you heard about the Ball Fresh Tech electric water bath canner? Is that it?
So that is an appliance that they came out with probably, 6-7 years ago now. They are still out there, but they are not making those anymore. I think their sales have dropped off a lot. They were kind of pricey because they started out at $300. You can probably find them out there for less cost, but they do not make those anymore, but they can still be used. You have to use the recipes that are made for that appliance. There's recipes in the book that comes with it. I think they have recipes on their website. I'd have to double check that for sure. So it is an alternative to water bath canning. It is not a pressure canner device, even though it looks like an electric pressure canner. That's not what it is. It is another way to do water bath canning. So again, you got to use the recipes that come with it so you know which buttons to push on it. And so it's limited. It's a small batch system because it only does 3 quarts, 4 pints, or up to 6 half pints. I've seen a few of those recipes come through. I do know of a couple families that have that appliance and they really like using it, but it's not for everybody. And so, but just know that the appliance itself, they don't make them anymore. So.
Okay. Would you drop a ribbon placement on the canned food if it was canned correctly but labeled wrong?
Yes, I would. Yeah. So that's, that all boils down to reading the rules. And we struggle with that every year. Just reading the fair book, because that information's all in there on what we're asking for. And the labels are already made, you just got to fill them out. So we tried as much as possible to make it as easy as possible. I know we ask for a lot, but there are a lot of good reasons for it. And so, so yes, I would.
Okay. Would the floating tomatoes example be disqualified or ribbon lowered?
I would do a ribbon lowered for sure, maybe even 2, depending on what else you're seeing, because there was a lot of bubbles in there. The head space was not right, and it was floating a lot, so it probably could have dropped a couple ribbons. So yeah, there were some issues with those.
So with the salsa lid darkening, would it be a disqualification because you can't tell if it's possibly mold?
Yeah, that one's really tricky. I probably would disqualify it because it is really hard to know until you open it up, and I'm just not going to open it up at the fair. So, and the other thing about mold is, if it really is growing, you'd probably see it growing down the side of the jar too, and it's probably getting into the food. Obviously that would be mold. But the pinholing part, it's probably more just on the lid itself. But it is something you got to take note of. And I think it's so hard. And I will have to say on that particular jar, I think I did disqualify it because I just didn't know. And so I'm erring on the side of caution and calling it mold. So.
Okay. I skipped a question, so I'm going to go back to that real quick. Bottled lemon juice is 5% acidity. I can't even say that. Why can vinegar at 5% not be used anymore?
Well, actually, lemon juice is down about to 2 to 3% acidic. So vinegar is 5%, and also while I'm thinking about it, pickles, all your pickled products, you have to use 5% acidity vinegar on your pickles. So on the 2%, 2 to 3% for lemon juice it's the pH, I should say, not percent. The pH of it is 2 to 3, between 2 and 3. Vinegar runs around 4 to 5. So that's why you have to use more vinegar if you're using that in tomatoes in order to get the proper amount of acidity as compared to lemon juice. And it just doesn't take as much lemon. You got more acidity power in lemon juice than you do vinegar. I hope that helps.
Okay. Is vinegar water okay for jars and rings? It won't cause erosion. And then she goes to say, I mean, vinegar and canning. I use vinegar water afterwards to wipe down jars.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's good. It's a great idea.
Okay, couldn't roll in the jar around dislodged things for future judging at the state fair.
Yeah, there's that. But the thing is, you have to see that stuff. So you got to roll it around and look at that. And by the time it gets to the state fair, it's probably going to settle back down. Now, the other option they could do, they may even enter a different jar. Technically, you're not supposed to do that, but I mean, in foods, you don't enter the same cake the second time either. So, but you got to roll it around. You got to look at things in order to really see what's inside of there. So don't feel bad about doing that.
Okay. They really enjoyed judging the visuals. They would love to know why people gave the Italian tomatoes a blue. I think it had to do with the date, possibly, or
yeah.
Let's see. There's a lot of good comments, Karen. You're gonna have to read these.
Okay, I will. I'm glad we have the option to save the comments. So that's
yes.
cool.
What is the bubble freer amount of times to go up and down in a jar?
Oh, that just depends on the product. I mean, essentially you go around the perimeter and then try to get down in the middle. So, there's really no set number. I would say at least 5 times maybe, but it just really depends on the product and what you're seeing. So there's really not an exact science to that one. The important thing is to do it. So.
Okay. So for sure, the date does not disqualify. It's just a ribbon lowering.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about how you interact with the youth during this judging?
Well, I like to, look at their recipe, ask them, why they made this product. Is this their favorite, one of their favorite things to make? Ask them, how long they've been doing food preservation. Ask them what other things they like to make. And then ask them to go through the process, see what they remember about actually making the product. Without looking at the recipe. If they can do that, that's really good. Now, sometimes every now and then I have to, show them the recipe to kind of remind them where they're at. And then they're like, oh yeah, but, that can often tell you whether they really did it or not too. And that goes, I think we kind of talked about that last week. Ask them, if you see something in there, show it to them so that they see what you're looking at, and help them learn those things. Talk to them about the importance of headspace, getting the bubbles out, those kinds of things. Show them the scorecard so that they see what you're looking at. I think that's a good guide so that they know that here's the things I'm looking at when I see this product. So. Yeah, have a good conversation with them. It's really quite fun.
Okay. How do you keep fruit submerged in the juice?
That's tricky. My personal challenge is peaches. I think I mentioned that earlier, because those things just like to float. And again, I think a lot of it goes back to the pack method. Peaches in particular, those can be done either hot or raw pack. Hot pack is really a better way to go all the way around. Those peaches have a lot of air trapped inside of them. And so the other thing that I've done on those peaches, as I'm filling the jar, I put peaches in, I put some liquid in, but I also work them around with my bubble freer to get the bubbles out. Because as those cavities on peaches can trap air. So move them around as you're filling the jar on something like it, especially if you do leave them in halves, so that they can get those bubbles out as you fill. I've found myself that works pretty well. The smaller fruits shouldn't float too much. Cherries, you usually prick the skins. They help keep them from floating. Another issue that I've seen is pickled okra. That's another one that likes to float. There's a lot of air inside of okra. So you might take a knife and just prick through the skin of those so that some of that air trapped inside gets out, and then they won't float so much.
Okay. What about food coloring in sweet pickles?
Unless it's in the recipe to start with, it should not be randomly added. Food coloring is, like I said earlier when I showed that jar of jalapeno jelly, that's the only one I can think of right off the top of my head where that's normal. Adding food coloring to pickles and such, oftentimes that's added to cover things up. They're trying to hide something. I know it looks, and actually in some cases it really doesn't look natural at all. So it's not needed, and it should not be added, unless it's in the recipe. And I don't know of any tested pickle recipes that have green food coloring added to them. Not off the top of my head.
Okay. How do you tell 4-Hers to get their jelly or jam from pan to jar?
Using a ladle, I think is probably the easiest thing, and then a funnel set inside the jar. So, after it's cooked, take that pan of jelly off the burner so it stops cooking. Let the bubbles settle down. If there's any foam, scrape that off. But a neat little trick to tell them if they have problems with foam is when they're cooking that jam or jelly mixture, add a half a teaspoon of butter or margarine to it, and that will almost completely get rid of all that foam. And then you don't have to scrape off anything. So it's a neat little trick. You don't even know it's there. And then gently use a ladle to get it from the pan into the jar with the funnel on top. So just takes a little practice.
Okay. What's the reason for only a 1/4-inch headspace on jellies?
Yeah, that product usually doesn't, the headspace is determined by how much movement happens in the jar during the processing. And with jams and jellies, they really don't move a whole lot. Hardly at all. So that's why that minimal amount of headspace that's all that's needed for those. On some of those other products where, something like tomatoes, it's going to move a little more. You got bigger food pieces. There's more movement inside the jar. And so it needs just a little bit more room to move around. Same thing with fruit. So that's part of the differences. It depends on the food and how much movement it happens during the processing.
Okay. Do you drop it a ribbon if it doesn't have a date on the jar?
Yeah, because you don't know when it was canned. So yeah.
Okay. Do the brand names need to match the jar and lid, like they're facing the same way?
Well, I don't get overly critical about that. That's probably the last thing I get concerned about. I'm more concerned about the product itself and the safety of it and all these other factors that we've been talking about. So if it comes down to a champion or reserve champion, then I might think about that. It is a little bit of a detail. It is a little bit part of the showmanship. But again, it's one of the last things I'm really going to look at. I'm more concerned about that lid sealing than whether it's lined up with the words. So anyway, there's a lot more things to be concerned about again.
On the relish with the big head space in the 2.5 hour time, is that a disqualification or a white?
Oh, I can't remember what I did on that one. Well, I can't remember what I gave on that one. It probably got disqualified actually, because it had multitude problems, and the processing, you know, they might have had the processing was probably right on the recipe, but what they wrote on the jar was completely wrong on that. But it was a definite white for sure. That's for sure.
Okay, so with the whole pickles, if there's no removal of the blossom ends, corrosion of the lid, wrinkling, what ribbon would you give?
Well, that one I'd probably give that one actually I'd probably give that one a white. And actually that was a jar that I saw at the state fair in open class, so I don't think I gave it a ribbon at all. So because they were just poor. But for 4-H, I'd probably give it a white. I think the processing time was right. It just had a lot of other issues on it.
Okay, does using iodized salt just lower a ribbon or disqualify?
Just lower a ribbon. It's not a safety issue. It's just, it could be a quality issue because of that sediment issue like I showed in that pickled beets, which, you know, could be confusing because like I said, that white sediment could also be a signal that spoilage might be happening. But in that case, it was iodized salt or table salt.
Okay, what if the ring is bent?
Well, you know, I would make note of that. And, you know, you have to factor in, you know, the other issues, you know, that you might find on that. You know, if you get the ring off and on, sometimes if it's bent, you can't get it on and off right. So, you know, that's another little attention to detail. It's probably a little more of an issue than if the names are lined up. Because if you can't get the lid off, then you can't measure the headspace, or the ring off, I mean, then you can't measure the headspace. So, so anyway, it's something to make note of. I wouldn't get real harsh on that, but anyway.
Okay, do fairs often get different judges for food and food preservations?
Again, that depends on the number of entries that they expect to have. And they usually know based on past experience, or they know what kids are doing. So if a fair, if they know they're only going to have maybe 10 jars, 5 to 10 jars of canned food, they're likely not going to hire a separate judge. They're likely going to use a foods judge that will also judge the food preservation. So if you're asked to be a foods judge, they will likely ask you if you would be willing to judge a food preservation too, so that they have a person lined up to do both. And then that way they can funnel those kids to you to judge those jars of food.
Okay, can you help me understand why the green salsa would get a blue ribbon? It didn't have a perfect lid, the ring looked bent, the top of the project was uneven in the jar, and there was no date.
The green salsa?
I think it might have been the relish.
Maybe the relish, the squash relish, maybe?
Yeah, I think it was maybe that one.
So I think we gave that a blue, I think. There were a few bubbles in there, just a few. So again, they just need to try to get those out with the bubble freer. Because excess air inside the jar could affect the quality and the safety of it down the line during storage. You know, again, it's that judge's opinion on that day. So I think it's a good blue. on that one.
Okay.
I think that's what we gave it.
I think so.
Okay.
I see someone made a comment that they see some water spots on lids. Is that okay or affect grade?
Well, and that's just another thing, you know, you could take a paper towel with vinegar on it and wipe it off. So, but that just shows you how hard our water here is in this state, and it's a common problem everywhere. So a little bit of vinegar can solve that problem real quick. I'm glad somebody saw that because I didn't mention that. So
Remind us what makes things float.
what makes things float? Okay, so usually it's because a raw pack was used when that option is available, such as in green beans, carrots, peaches, apples. And the raw pack, the food in the food itself has a lot of trapped air inside of it. And when you do the raw pack, at some point during the processing, that air is going to come out. And if you don't pack the jars tight enough, then that food's going to shrink, and then that food's going to float because the air got released and the food shrank, and then you end up with floating food. So it's mainly due to using the raw pack method. So that's why it's tricky, and how well that food gets tightly packed into the jars so that you can prevent that from happening. Those carrots that I showed you, that was a raw pack. And so those were pretty well packed into that jar, and that helped prevent them from floating so much. But again, hot pack is really the best way to go all the way around.
Okay. So for the raw pack meat, is it okay for the liquid to be lower than the meat, or is that a disqualification or a downgrade?
No, that's fine, because you know that liquid that's in there, that's what came out of the meat itself. There was no added liquid to that, because when you do raw pack for chunks like that, you only put the meat in the jar. You don't add any extra liquid to it. So whatever juice comes out of the meat, that's what's going to be there. So that's going to be normal. That's going to be normal.
Okay.
So you don't count down on that.
So what did you give the squirrel meat with the tiny bit of fur?
I actually gave it a blue because they did everything else right. Everything else was done right. I just happened to see that little bit of fur. And full disclosure, I saw that jar at the county level. And when I first saw it, I read through the recipe. Of course, seeing the word squirrel just threw me all off. And had a great conversation with the young man. His dad was there too, and he was about to roll on the floor. And but I actually almost gave him a white to start with because I thought he had underprocessed it. But then I realized the bones were still in there, and so he actually did process it right. I did not see the fur at the county level. I just didn't see it there. And I actually ended up giving him a purple is what I gave him. And so that's how it ended up at the state fair, but that fur showed up. So I did drop him a ribbon on it at the state fair level down to a blue. And I made note, I fessed up. I made note on the scorecard that I did not see that at the county level, but I did see it here. So anyway, he did a great job with it anyway.
Yeah, his grandma was on the training. She made a comment.
Excellent. Good.
Are dried noodles an acceptable food preservation exhibit?
You know, I honestly have never seen that show up. But we don't have a scorecard for that either. So if it does show up, which would be fine because it is a dried product. A couple things to look for on that. I will just mention a couple things. Look for discoloration, because sometimes that's a sign that there's moisture trapped on the inside of that. What happens sometimes if the noodles are too thick, they get dried on the outside before the inside moisture gets out. That's called case hardening. And so that, that noodle can look discolored. So they should be even, they should be brittle, they should easily break apart, should have a nice noodle color to them. So, you know, I'm honestly, like I said, I've never seen them show up, and they don't even at the state fair level, they don't even, I've never seen them there either, even in open class. So, but I guess there's always a first time for everything, like squirrel.
That's funny. I gave it blue on the raw pack beef only because there was no date. So if it had a proper date, would it have been a purple?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Probably. That's pretty good. It was done well.
Is it okay to try the dried products?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that, because you do need to pick those up and feel those and check for moisture. You know, like I talked about on the fruit leather, you need to bend those. Even on jerky, take them out of the jar. All these, they should be entered in jars, not in like Ziploc bags, because of it helps protect them from getting damaged. So even on the jerky, you want to feel it. It shouldn't feel real greasy. I think that's on the scorecard to look for. It should be pretty lean. You don't want to see any grease or excess grease. There might be a little, but you don't want it just to be slimy. That's just ugly, because it could go rancid. And it should break easily. It shouldn't be real tough. So yeah, I don't have a problem. And also, even on the vegetables and herbs, just to kind of feel those and make sure that they're properly dried.
Okay. Could you talk about any changes to recipes or equipment that a flat top stove may make?
Okay, so here's the thing about flat top stoves. First of all, follow what your stove manufacturer says. If they say you cannot can on that stove, you should not do it. The risk that happens is because of the weight and the heat of the canning process, could crack your stovetop, and you don't want that to happen. And I've heard of it happening. I've seen pictures of it happening. So follow your stove manufacturer. Now, for the canners, your water bath canners, and your pressure canners, for that matter, they need to have a completely flat bottom. If you use those old speckled water bath canners that have the ridges on the bottom, you really do not get a good heat transfer from the stove into the canner. So it takes a long time to heat up. I've tried it on my own stove. It takes a long time to heat up those old granite ware speckled canners on a flat stove. So there are flat bottomed water bath canners. I know even just a flat stock pot. And as long as you can get some kind of rack inside of there, the diameter, the size of the canner should not hang over your burner size no more than 1 inch. So that's the other thing to look for. Pressure canners. The only brand that I know of that can be used on a flat top stove is Presto. Miro and All American do not recommend it. It says it right on their instructions, right on their box. So Presto is the only one, and it's the new style of Presto canners. Presto also has a version of their pressure canner, their dial gauge pressure canner, that can be used on induction stovetops. They came out with that last year. All that's on my website. You can see the information about that. But today's version of Presto canners are what can be used on the flat top stoves. So be careful about that, because I don't want you to crack your stove top.
Okay. If lids are stored in a storage unit, do they get too hot and will it decrease the seal?
Well, it depends on the temperature of your storage unit. If it's out in the heat, out in the sun, there's no temperature control on it, yeah, that's going to shorten the shelf life of them because it could warp them. They could stick together. You know, that's going to, just like, I mean, you should store them in a cool, dry, dark place, just like storing food. That's really the best place because of that sealing compound, so that you get the best life out of it as you possibly can.
Okay. How is a label filled out for a fresh tech?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that one is a little tricky because Fresh Tech automatically adjusts for altitude for you. What I would put on there is the amount of time that the actual cycle takes. So make note of that time. I would definitely put down still need to put down your altitude. You know, that appliance is going to adjust for your altitude for you. That's part of the technology in that. So for sure, put down your own altitude, and then definitely put down the entire processing time that it takes to do that. That's about all you can do. And make note obviously on your recipe, you're going to make note on there that you're using that Fresh Tech appliance.
Okay. How long are canned items food safe?
We recommend using all of these things within 1 year of canning. That's for best safety, for best quality. Can they last longer? Yeah, probably likely. But you're not putting these things in a museum. You can these things to use them. So use them. I've heard of some frightening stories of people cleaning out basements and cellars of some mystery foods. And so they do not last forever, despite stories you might hear. So use them up, rotate them out, because you're likely going to grow a garden again the next year or whatever. You got to make room for the new stuff. So use it. You put all that work into it, enjoy it.
Okay. Wouldn't hot pack meat be a better choice?
Yes, it really is, because you get more meat in the jar. You add liquid to it, so the liquid is going to cover the meat better. When you do a raw pack, you're kind of at the mercy of what kind of juice is going to come out of the meat. So yeah, the hot pack really is a better way to go on everything,
Okay, that is the last question. There's a lot of great comments, but no more questions.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. So glad that you stuck with me. I know a few of you are still left. So look for the survey to come out. Thanks for hanging with me again tonight. I know it was a long evening, but we had a lot of things to talk about. So appreciate your willingness to do this. With me, and I hope you really learned a lot, and look forward to seeing you at some fairs this year, whatever way, shape, and form they just might be. Yet to be determined. So thank you all.